you're looking at a very short period after that, and then the start on activities. And depending where we are in the process, we can already start some of our renovation work in advance. So it's from a start date. There's multiple factors that play into a start date beyond just the extension.
Thank you.
All right. I'm sorry. Are you finished, Dr. Jones-Albertus?
I had one question for Oxen, if there's time.
All right. What I'm going to say is I do not want to cut off discussion. We have reached the official end of questions and answers. And I note that Dr. Gorman also has a question. So please ask your question. Then I'll ask Dr. Gorman to present her question. And I would ask Ronalda to take the time that track the time that we are going over, and to allow the same amount of extra time for panel 2. And I would ask the folks responding to the questions to please be very brief and to not repeat things that previous responders have said. Thank you.
Thank you. So my question for Oxen is, given that there is no existing cell production in the US, and you stated support for removing the TRQ in entirety, can you speak to how the higher prices that you'd need to pay to import cells impact your business model?
We'll definitely, thank you for the question. We'll definitely need to pay a little bit more, but I anticipate the same result that we saw with the 201 tariffs on the modules, which is to have minimal, if no impact on the business. And so what I mean by that is, just like the tariffs have supposedly have increased the price of modules that in the marketplace, we see the installations have gone up and the prices have come down. The impact has been minimal. I suspect it'll be the same thing for the cells. But as I said in my testimony, we're willing to make that sacrifice because you need to bring the upstream. You need to bring cell manufacturing here in the U.S. So I bring credibility to this argument because I'm a module manufacturer. But yeah, to answer your question, I don't think it's going to have any detrimental impact.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Dr. Jones-Albertus. Dr. Gorman.
Thanks, Will. Just a question for Suniva. So you spoke in depth about the focus of the investment community on the long-term recovery of costs, particularly regarding cell manufacturing in the US. And I'm just curious, would an investor find it more economically viable to open a combined cell and module facility versus a standalone greenfield cell production facility? Curious to hear your perspective.
I think different people will make different decisions. But I think there's obviously some economies of scale in creating both. But I think, as we've seen already, again, I go back to case point, and I'll be brief since, as Will requested, we don't have to look any further than Jinko Solar. It came down to an economic decision. Jinko said, and certainly had the financial capability to do it, to build an integrated plant here. For that matter, so did Hanwha or LG. They chose not to because the economics were more advantageous to continue to use imported cells while building modules here, and they satisfied the requirements of satisfying the 201 safeguards. So there is economic advantages to it, but investors will look at multiple calculations as to what's the way to do that. What they look first and foremost for is a signal that these issues aren't going to go away, that the US government is committed to a full supply chain, no matter how big or marginal.
Well, that was my only question. Thank you.
All right. Now, I also want to be sure we're not cutting off queries unnecessarily. Dr. Boucher or Dr. Jones-Albertus, do you have any additional questions that you think warrant us going over the limit?
I do not. Thank you.
Similarly, thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, then, Mr. Gagan, could we proceed to, first I should thank all of the folks on the first panel for your being here and presenting this testimony and your responding to our questions. This has been very informative to us and will help us in putting together our recommendation for the president. So with that, Mr. Gagan, could we move to the next panel?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Martin. We dismiss the first panel with our thanks, and we will pause for approximately 5 minutes to compose the second panel. Thank you.
This is George. Will you activate my camera?
Mike, just wanted to check. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can. Thank you. We're still in the process of switching between panels 1 and panel 2. So just bear with us for a few moments. Once we promote you, you should be able to use video and audio. Thanks. We will now proceed with panel 2. On panel 2, we have, first of all, counsel to the Solar Energy Industries Association and to NextEra Energy Incorporated. We have the Solar Energy Industries Association. We have EDF Renewable Distributed Solutions Incorporated. We have Borrego Solar Systems Incorporated, Solve Energy, Sonova Energy Corporation, the American Clean Power Association, and NextEra Energy. The participants on panel 2 have a combined 60 minutes to provide testimony. Based on prior communications, each of them has indicated that they will provide approximately 7.5 minutes of testimony. We will set the clock for 1 hour based on the requests of this panel, and we will track the aggregated time, and then we will shift to the Q&A session. Similar to the first panel, as each of you take the floor, please indicate your name and title so that our court reporter can capture that. Mr. Nicely, are you ready? And is everybody on your panel ready?
Thanks, Mike. I do believe we're all here, and yes, we're ready.
Okay, thank you. Please proceed.
Thanks very much. I'm Matt Nicely of Aiken Gump Strauss Hauer and Feld, counsel to the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA, and NextEra Energy. I'm going to kick off a panel today to set the proper legal context for the trade policy decision facing the committee and ultimately the president. First, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that safeguard actions are an extraordinary form of relief aimed at addressing the effects of presumptively fair trade, that is, trade in products for which there is no proof of unfair trade activity. During the last 20 years, only 3 products have been subject to U.S. safeguard actions: steel, residential washers, and solar cells and panels. Extension of such actions is even more extraordinary. Until last year, it had literally never happened. No president except Donald Trump has extended a safeguard action beyond the first 3 or 4 years. And even when Donald Trump extended the washer safeguard, he did so from an initial period of 3 years and added only 2 more years for an extended total period of 5 years. Here, the safeguard has already been in effect for nearly 4 years, and the domestic industry is seeking an additional 4. That's 8 years of total safeguard relief against fairly traded imports. This would be unprecedented for any product, for any president. In fact, extensions of any kind are rare across the globe, and with good reason. The WTO Safeguards Agreements permits trading partners to seek compensation or suspend concessions for safeguard measures that stay in place over 3 years. If the president extends these safeguard measures, we should expect that our trading partners will impose retaliatory tariffs on billions of dollars worth of U.S. exports, as is their right. The notion that we would take such rare action and risk retaliation over the products in question here would be senseless. This case is not about a consumer item like residential washers, where less demand as a result of higher prices is not the end of the world. But here, the Biden-Harris administration has already identified massive increases in solar deployment as a key component of its policies to fight climate change, which President Biden himself has called an existential threat. And those massive increases in social deployment cannot happen without a massive increase in the supply of crystalline silicon photovoltaic, or CSPV, solar cells and panels that are the subject of this safeguard action. And that increase in supply cannot happen without significantly more imports. Whatever additional capacity the domestic industry might be planning to build in the next few years, it will still be a drop in the bucket compared with what the market needs to meet the goals set forth in this administration's Department of Energy's Solar Futures Study. To extend safeguards on products that are a centerpiece of this administration's climate change policy would be illogical. It would mean carrying on with the policies of a prior administration that denied that climate change was something to even be concerned about. I said at the beginning of my testimony that I was going to provide legal context for our panel today. You might wonder what my discussion about climate policy has to do with the law. It has everything to do with the law. It is not the president's job merely to consider the commission's views on what would facilitate the domestic industry's adjustment to import competition and to decide if he agrees or disagrees. It's the president's job also to compare the economic and social costs versus benefits of a safeguard action. This is a foundational element of Section 201, enshrined in the very first paragraph of the law, and it's something the commission elected not to address. Notwithstanding our efforts to get them to consider it, they decided this is the president's job, not theirs. And there is no question whatsoever that the costs of the safeguard measure on CSPV modules in particular have exceeded their benefits, and their extension will just be more of the same. Now, let me be clear. SEIA, ACP, and all of the industry representatives with us today agree that having a large, thriving domestic industry producing CSPV products would be ideal. After all, the supply chain interruptions associated with reliance on imports has become a huge burden, particularly in the last couple of years. And we can't battle climate change without imports and a significant volume of them. And as Abby Hopper from SEIA will testify, the safeguard measures on those imports have cost tens of thousands of jobs along the solar supply chain, cost consumers billions of dollars, and dampened demand by increasing the cost of solar projects and challenging the economics of solar as compared to other sources of electricity in many parts of the country. It's time for adoption of policies that will allow solar to flourish unabated while also incentivizing domestic manufacturing, which can and should be done by lowering tariffs on manufacturing equipment and inputs and passing legislation that puts money in the pockets of the domestic producers who produce here in the USA. Next, I want to address the legal question of whether the administration can impose safeguard duties on bifacial panels as part of this extension proceeding. This is not a question of extension of safeguard duties. This is a question of reimposition of such duties, because the safeguard currently does not apply to these imports since the Court of International Trade issued its November 16, 2021 decision in SEIA versus the United States, nullifying Donald Trump's Proclamation 10101. As the court concluded, once a product has been excluded from a safeguard action, reimposition of safeguard measures on that product violate the statute's requirement that the trade restrictions be progressively liberalized. The president does not have the authority to reimpose safeguard duties now for the same reasons identified by the court in the SEIA decision. The domestic producers have argued that the president can trigger Section 204(b)(2) of the Trade Act because they claim imports of bifacial panels are circumventing the safeguard action. This is nonsense. During the periods the exclusion has been in place since June 2019, importers did exactly what the exclusion specifically allowed them to do, which is to import bifacial panels free of safeguard duties. There can be no circumvention when importers are doing exactly what the exclusion contemplated. You should also reject the prior panel's insinuation that original requesters of the bifacial exclusion misled USTR. Pinegate, the lead requester, specifically said that, quote, the exclusion would pave the way for greater adoption of bifacial modules in the utility segment. In other words, one of the key purposes was to increase demand for the product because of the greater efficiencies to be gained. In any event, the president may therefore only consider extension of safeguard duties currently in effect. That means that any extended safeguard action would be limited to CSPV cells and monofacial CSPV panels at duty rates of less than 15%. But even if Proclamation 101 were still in effect, the fact remains that imposition of safeguard duties on solar products of any kind undermines the Biden-Harris administration's battle against climate change and imposes greater economic and social costs than benefits. It's time to bring these safeguard measures to an end and allow solar deployment in the United States to reach its full potential. Abby?
Thank you, Matt. Good morning. I'm Abby Hopper, President and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA. As a national trade association for the U.S. solar industry, SEIA represents the entire supply chain, including companies that promote, manufacture, install, and support the development of American solar energy. During the original safeguard investigation, SEIA led the opposition to these tariffs. We believe strongly that the cost of these measures would significantly outweigh any benefit to domestic producers. Unfortunately, we were right about that. At the time of the original investigation, we forecast that tariffs in the range of 30% would lead to several gigawatts of lost deployment, tens of thousands of lost jobs, and billions of dollars of lost investments. And unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. In contrast, petitioners argued that the tariffs would create 45,000 jobs in solar manufacturing alone. So who are you going to believe going forward? The side whose earlier forecasts were prescient, or the one that just plain got it wrong? The president should not let history repeat itself. It's a time to end the solar safeguard measures. The costs are simply too high. As you know, and as Matt talked about, this administration has recognized that rapid and widespread deployment of solar energy is critical for the fight against climate change. As the Department of Energy found in its Solar Future study, the United States must double its annual solar deployment in the early 2020s and quadruple deployment by the mid to late 2020s and beyond. Domestic module production alone cannot reach these goals, and is currently inadequate at only 3.8 gigawatts relative to the current annual demand of more than 20 gigawatts. This is particularly true in the utility scale segment, which represents nearly 75% of the total US solar market, and where there is almost no domestic module capacity. To address this supply shortfall in the utility segment, and as far back as 2018, SEIA has been the leading advocate for excluding bifacial modules from the Section 201 tariffs. We fought for the exclusion before it was granted and then against the unlawful attempts to revoke it. And contrary to what petitioners have said, no domestic supplier is currently able to produce bifacial modules at the scale required for utility scale projects. And as you'll hear later, 150 megawatts of bifacial module production capacity won't even qualify a company to compete for most utility scale projects where scale and bankability are so important. It is critical that the administration maintain this exclusion. The administration should also get rid of the tariffs on imported cells for the benefit of not only domestic producers, but also their customers who are mainly in the rooftop segment. We were surprised that the Commission concluded that keeping the cell TRQ in place will drive investments in domestic cell capacity. This just doesn't square with commercial realities as we understand them, or even the history of the safeguard measure. US consumers have also paid an estimated $2.8 billion in tariffs on imported modules since February of 2018, implying an average cost of $1.4 million per CSPV job. Going forward, the consumer cost of extending the safeguard tariff and withdrawing the bifacial panel exclusion is over $6.5 billion, with the majority of that burden, $4.15 billion, falling on the utility scale segment. Under an extension, the cost per job would grow to $6.5 million. Let me repeat that, $6.5 million per module manufacturing job. Next, I would like to address some of the questions that you asked in advance. You asked SEIA about the impact of the duties on prices faced by consumers, and to respond to LG's rebuttal comments that the impact was close to zero. Simply said, LG misses the point. The reality is that increasing the cost of modules challenges the economics of solar projects compared to other sources of electricity. Consumers may not pay significantly more for electricity, but solar becomes less cost competitive with added tariffs. GTM research found that solar is now less expensive than other forms of new power supply in 16 states. And while solar could be competitive in all but 4 states by 2025, that depends on the long-term trend of declining prices. Extending the safeguard tariff would undermine this progress. Moreover, SEIA estimates that the United States has lost almost 13,000 total solar jobs due to the negative deployment effects of the safeguard tariffs, in addition to almost 20,000 projected new solar jobs that were never realized. This reversed years of steady growth in US solar jobs that had occurred prior to imposition of the safeguard measures, as again, the costs are too high. You also asked about job losses in 2020 and whether COVID is to blame. What's important here is that we have unquestionably lost jobs because of tariffs long before COVID, and these jobs have not yet returned. Extending the tariffs will only extend the damage. It is also indisputable that the safeguard measures have slowed deployment by several gigawatts. Total solar installments fell in 2017 and 2018 as a direct result of the safeguard investigation after years of dynamic growth, a loss of nearly 5.5 gigawatts of deployment from 2018 to 2020 alone. This is consistent with SEIA's original studies conducted during the investigation. And even though deployment has increased since 2018, it would have gone up even more without the tariffs. Lost solar deployment is a missed opportunity to address climate change, and one we can no longer afford. I also note that Wood Mackenzie recently lowered its 2022 outlook for solar installations by 25%, which reflects a staggering decrease of 7.4 gigawatts of deployment. In adjusting its forecast, Wood Mackenzie opined that 2022 will be a challenging year for the solar industry because of the, quote, ongoing solar supply chain constraints and price increases. Now, the prices for CSPV panels in the United States are the highest in the world. The commission staff found that US prices are 50% higher than elsewhere. GTM research found that, quote, if the US extends the same set of tariffs for another round, by 2026, it may cost twice as much to buy solar modules in the US than in Europe or Canada, end quote. The suggestion that the safeguard has not had any impact on price is simply false. By extending the tariffs, the administration would place an even greater burden on already severely strained solar supply chain. You also asked how extension would affect the broader US solar industry. Clearly, placing safeguard tariffs on modules in the years ahead, when deployment is already expected to be negatively impacted by rising costs and supply chain constraints, will make solar less competitive with other forms of energy. This will result in suppressed demand for solar energy, fewer jobs, less solar deployed, and the loss of precious time in our fight against climate change. Regarding the impact of extension on US cell and module producers, domestic manufacturers are poised for dramatic growth, but tariffs are not going to be the driver. What these companies need are long-term federal investments. And even with these investments, it will take several years before we see significant growth in domestic capacity. Under any scenario, the US solar industry will continue to rely on imported modules, including continued imports from US module producers themselves. Extension of the safeguard will not change this reality. So SEIA has long argued that tariffs are ineffective at growing solar manufacturing and that what's needed instead is a suite of long-term policy options. In September 2019, SEIA published a manufacturing white paper, which opines that growing domestic solar manufacturing requires 1, demand drivers such as a long-term extension of the solar investment tax credit with a bonus for domestic content, 2, manufacturing tax credits, and 3, ongoing domestic production support as companies and their suppliers scale operations. Importantly, all 3 categories of federal investments are required if we hope to be globally competitive, and Congress is close to enacting just such a program under the Build Back Better Act. Indeed, SEIA is a lead proponent of the climate provisions of Build Back Better, including Senator John Ossoff's Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Act, or SEMA. We forecast that these investments would create 27,000 direct manufacturing jobs by 2025 and 40,000 by 2030. This is how we help domestic manufacturers. Finally, all the great news we're hearing about new US solar manufacturing investments has little to do with the potential extension of the Section 201 tariffs. Rather, it's all about the climate provisions of the Build Back Better Act, and SEMA in particular. SEIA has fought hard to make Build Back Better provisions provide domestic manufacturers with the help that they need. More tariffs are simply not the solution. The costs are just too high. Thank you. Ron?
Hi, I'm Vanessa Shera, Vice President for Trade International Competitiveness at the American Clean Power Association, or ACP. We represent the companies that build, finance, own, and operate a majority of the utility-scale solar projects in the United States. Our companies work every day to help American utilities and businesses find ways to meet President Biden's goal of creating a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035. We agree with the previous witnesses on this panel that what is needed to reach this goal is quick and decisive action to reduce barriers to utility-grade renewable energy installation. This in turn requires rapid deployment of large utility-grade bifacial CSPV products that are not used in the residential and commercial markets and are not currently produced at scale in the United States. Achieving these aggressive but necessary targets requires a thoughtful balancing of what is most important to the national interest. We believe that the TPSC should recommend that the present act to confirm that imports of utility-scale products and specifically bifacial panels should not be subject to further Section 201 tariffs. Looking at the statutory language of 201, the president is authorized to take appropriate and feasible action that provides greater economic and social benefits than costs. In essence, he must consider the ITC recommendation in the broader context of what is best, not just for the petitioners, but what is best for the country overall. In contrast, the ITC report was limited to a narrow examination of the domestic industry's experience under the past 4 years of tariff protection. In fact, the ITC made no findings or recommendations as to the economic impact on all Americans of extending its proposed tariff measures. The utility solar market requires access to a dependable supply of utility-scale modules to meet the massive demand for large-scale solar projects. To build on this progress toward meeting the renewable energy goals of the administration, ACP asked that the TPSC consider how tariffs on bifacial modules, which would add to other headwinds facing the utility solar industry, would impact these larger social and economic goals. I am pleased that in your specific questions posed to ACP, you focused on the issue of whether the ITC erred in finding that there was no market segmentation in the CPSV industry. We continue to believe that the ITC made a significant analytic error when it rejected the concept that there are essentially two distinct markets for solar modules. It is true that the ITC found some domestic utility scale module production and some evidence of bifacial modules sold in the residential market. But what is critical to an accurate assessment of this data is scale and context. Any domestic production is simply minuscule when compared to the massive demand of utility projects. Further, industry representatives from companies representing the largest utility-grade solar developers in the country spoke directly to this dynamic at the ITC hearing and unfortunately were largely ignored. We understand that the TPSC has received the complete record from the ITC proceeding, and we urge you to consider the direct testimony and sworn declarations of these company representatives as they explained how the supply and demand conditions of the solar utility market affected their purchasing decisions. In particular, we cite to ACP's October 27th pre-hearing brief at Exhibits 2 and 3, which were declarations from ACP members Clearway and Invenergy. Their testimony noted that they knew of no domestic suppliers that have manufactured utility-grade bifacial modules in a quantity sufficient to support utility-scale developments. Further information that is consistent with this will be provided by NextEra and EDF representatives on this panel. Further, you asked us to comment on Hanwha's statement regarding the, quote, dedicated production line for 72 cell modules, end quote. Again, context is key. Just because Hanwha itself claims that it has a, quote, material percentage, end quote, of its production in bifacial, says nothing about what percentage of overall utility project demand Hanwha or the domestic industry can supply. We urge the TPSC to closely consider the broader context of these utility scale projects, which are simply massive when compared to the inconsistent and inadequate capacity of domestic producers. I would further refer you to ACP's post-hearing brief at page 13, and also Annex 4, where we respond to Commissioner Spendlight's questions, where you can see that the utility scale production was woefully insufficient during the POI to meet the demand of the utility market. What we continue to find perplexing is that the ITC did not refute the evidence provided directly by procurement officials who work for the companies engaged in the most significant large-scale solar deployment projects. Instead, they chose to disregard the experience of these officials entirely. I urge you to consider their approach as you hear from others on this panel who work on a daily basis in this industry as to their experience both with regard to their attempts to purchase from U.S. domestic manufacturers, as well as their business concerns about the needs of utility-grade developers. Acting as the TPSC, you can assess the ITC's conclusions and assess whether the ITC was justified in rejecting the actual on-the-ground experiences of ACP's solar energy developers, who comprise the largest purchasers of solar modules, in deference to testimony of witnesses who, as a practical matter, have very limited experience dealing with purchasers outside the context of residential and small-scale commercial applications. You also asked us to expand upon our statement that we are supporting increasing domestic manufacturing footprint for utility-grade projects. ACP has been very public in its advocacy of the long-term extension of the renewable energy investment tax and production tax credits. When coupled with manufacturing tax incentives currently being debated in Congress, long-term certainty around these credits will bring the necessary market stability to maintain existing domestic manufacturing capacity and to encourage additional investments in domestic clean energy supply. As a final matter, I would like to address the CIT decision of November 16th. This case bears consideration because it means that, as a current legal matter, bifacial modules are excluded from the Section 201 tariffs, and there are no measures on bifacial products to extend. We recommend that the President confirm that the CSPV bifacial modules remain excluded from further Section 201 tariffs. Even if there is an increase in the domestic manufacturing footprint of utility-grade products, which ACP does not oppose, the practical reality is that production on the scale necessary to meet U.S. utility-scale deployment needs would take years to come online, leaving U.S. utility-grade solar developers with no option but to import these modules and pay tariffs. Tariffs on imported bifacial modules will translate into higher electricity costs for solar energy operators, as that cost will be passed on to consumers in the economy as a whole. The net result of reintroducing tariffs on bifacial products will be a negative and inflationary impact on consumers and less solar deployment overall. The short and long-term economic costs of extending these measures must, under the statute, be considered by the President. Our ability as a country to meet the clean energy targets established by the Biden-Harris administration with insufficient domestic capacity is, simply put, a significant cost for all Americans. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Ron? Ron, it looks like you may be frozen. Ron, are you there? If Ron is having trouble, maybe we should move on to Jamie.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Although Jamie, it looks like Ron is back on.
I lost my
Okay,
connection.
go ahead,
Can you hear
Ron.
me?
Yep.
Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, sorry about that. Lost my connection. Good morning. My name is Ron Reagan. I am the Executive Vice President for Engineering, Construction, and Integrated Supply Chain for NextEra Energy. In my operating questions posed by the TPSC to NextEra. NextEra is the largest renewable energy company in the world. NextEra and its affiliates own and operate approximately 58 gigawatts of total electric generating capacity. We employ over 14,000 people throughout the United States, and our projects create thousands of additional local U.S. jobs every year. As one of the largest capital investors in U.S. infrastructure, we are planning to invest more than $60 billion over the next 4 years. We have already invested billions of dollars in utility-scale solar generation projects in 33 U.S. states. Extension of safeguard measures has only occurred once in our history, and the president must consider how an extension would harm solar deployment, which is required to combat climate change. To meet the ambitious climate goals of the Biden administration, the U.S. energy industry must significantly increase the share of U.S. solar energy production from approximately 4% of U.S. electricity production today to 40% of U.S. electricity production by 2035. And an estimated 80 to 90% of added solar capacity will need to be in the form of utility-scale solar projects like those developed by NextEra. As NextEra has maintained throughout these safeguard extension proceedings, the domestic industry has no meaningful presence in the utility-scale segment of the market. The TPSC asked us to address the WTO panel's finding that the domestic industry was present in the utility segment, and the ITC's finding that a plurality of the domestic industry's reported shipments of CSPV modules went to the utility segment in 2020 and interim 2021. The pages cited either rely on confidential data to which we do not have access or refer to residential installations, which doesn't appear relevant to the question. In any event, I can speak to the Commission's finding that in 2020 and interim 2021, a plurality of the domestic industry shipments went to the utility scale segment. First, the Commission's data is flawed because the Commission did not meaningfully engage in a market segmentation analysis. The Commission rejected the respondents' recommendation to clearly define the utility scale segment and collect data on U.S. shipments by market segment. Instead, the Commission relied on its typical channels of distribution questions, which did not clearly capture commercial.
Is Ron frozen again?
Enough new U.S. module manufacturing capacity for the utility scale market. Domestic module manufacturing increased by approximately 2.6 gigawatts during the 4 years of safeguard measures. Solar module demand grew by approximately 15 gigawatts during those same 4 years and is expected to grow by another approximately 40 gigawatts over the next 4 years to meet the Biden administration's goals. Safeguard measures have not been effective in creating the domestic manufacturing we need to balance domestic supply with domestic demand. An even greater restriction on domestic supply of utility scale capacity is that no U.S. producer manufactures bifacial modules for utility scale applications, which currently make up more than 80% of our projects. This means that NextEra cannot even consider domestic producers for the great majority of our projects, which has been the case since NextEra began shifting to the use of bifacial modules in 2019. The TPSC asked NextEra to explain the increase in bifacial module imports following the imposition of safeguard measures in light of the fact that bifacial technology was not available at the time the safeguard measures went into effect. The shift to bifacial modules was long anticipated and revolutionary to utility scale solar deployment. Even before the safeguard measures went into effect, we were aware that solar manufacturers around the world were developing bifacial technology, and we were eagerly anticipating designing and integrating this technology into our projects. Once bifacial technology became available, it was a game changer for our projects because it allowed us to maximize the amount of electricity that a project can produce. Because of these efficiencies, we shifted the vast majority of NextEra's utility scale deployments to bifacial modules. And this shift continued to occur even after President Trump withdrew the bifacial module exclusion, showing that the conversion to bifacial modules was not conditional on the exclusion. This move to bifacial technology is not limited to the United States either. Utility scale developers worldwide have done the same because of the clear advantages of bifacial modules. However, despite the widespread global adoption of bifacial technology, no U.S. producer currently manufactures bifacial modules in the quantity necessary for our large projects. The TPSC also asked whether the safeguard measures resulted in any changes to sourcing plans for CSPV cells and modules. The answer is no. The utility scale segment is moving to bifacial modules, regardless of the safeguard measures. U.S. producers simply have not responded to this clear shift in the market, so we have no choice but to source from foreign suppliers that manufacture the bifacial product we require. It's all about scale. Domestic producers continue to focus on supplying the residential and commercial segments of the market, not the utility scale sector. Even Hanwha, which supplies some monofacial modules to utility scale developers, dedicates the vast majority of its supply to residential and small commercial buyers, and has very little capacity available for NextEra or the rest of the utility scale sector. The safeguard measures only act to make utility scale projects less economically viable and solar energy more expensive for end-use consumers of electricity. The president must also examine whether extension of safeguard measures provides greater economic and social benefits than costs. The safeguard measures have depressed demand in solar projects because they add significant and unexpected costs to the large projects developed by utility scale companies. When bidding on projects, solar can lose out to other less expensive forms of energy because of the added costs and uncertainty caused by the safeguard measures. Long-term power purchase agreements are negotiated and priced based on costs expected at the time the agreement is signed. The future addition of costs, such as duties imposed under the extension of safeguard measures, can make a project no longer economically viable. Extension of the safeguard measures will only make this problem worse, while doing little to increase the domestic production of modules. This slows deployment of utility scale solar energy, which is critical to expanding clean energy technology in the United States. The cost of safeguard measures far outweigh any incremental benefit to the domestic industry. For these reasons, extension of the safeguard measures is simply not the right answer for America. This is especially the case for bifacial modules. In light of domestic supply constraints and the solar goals of the Biden administration, which are dependent on utility scale deployment that rely on bifacial technology. Earlier this year, domestic module producers and solar developers worked together on policy that achieves positive adjustment for the domestic module industry while maintaining strong demand for solar projects. U.S. manufacturing incentives and tax credits are currently proposed in the Build Back Better Act that meet the needs of all parties in this case. This is good policy that would benefit and strengthen domestic manufacturing without increasing costs and without restricting imports that are necessary to meet demand and increase solar growth in the United States. This is the type of policy required to meet the Biden administration's climate goals and make a meaningful impact on carbon emissions. NextEra therefore requests that the president not extend these harmful safeguard measures, but rather allow us to move in a new direction that benefits the U.S. solar industry as a whole, including passing needed manufacturing incentives and tax credits. Thank you.
Jamie.
Good morning. My name is James Resor, and I'm the CEO of EDF Renewables Distributed Solutions, just for 6 years, and have worked for a total of 15 years in many facets of the solar industry. Headquartered in California, EDF Renewables is one of the largest utility scale renewable energy developers in the US, with over 20 gigawatts of developed projects. We employ approximately 1,400 employees in the US, and for example, over the last year, have collectively created and supported hundreds of construction jobs in those states, in addition to numerous jobs in engineering, development, operations, and administration. The utility market is by far the largest segment of the US market and is key for the Biden administration's goal of carbon-free electricity generation by 2035. As a rule, domestic CSPV manufacturers are not capable of supplying the utility segment. Most domestic module producers focus on the residential and small-scale commercial segments, which have smaller projects and higher profit margins. Domestic producers do not have the production capacity to provide the volume that we need for our utility scale projects. Also, suppliers must be able to effectively deliver modules not only that are suitable in the utility scale projects, but at a rate of at least 20 megawatts per week. And then these same suppliers have other customers, so therefore they really need to be able to supply 50 megawatts a week for the US market, which is approximately 2 gigawatts per year. But hardly any domestic CSP producers have near that capacity other than Hanwha to produce the volume and pace that we need for our utility scale projects, and thus are not capable of meeting this requirement. In addition, we also need to trust our suppliers and rely on their long cooperation for dedicated supply, and also because the functionality and performance of the modules and other system components, such as single axis trackers, which we procure separately, are very interrelated and must remain compatible with the module provider. This further limits the pool of potential module suppliers. Moreover, I strongly disagree with the assertions by Hanwha and LG that the same type of module is used in all applications. Residential and small-scale commercial projects are generally located on residential roofs or commercial buildings with all the modules in a stationary position, and the modules are suited for those purposes. Utility scale segment requires specific kinds of modules such as bifacial, and typically with larger wafers as the industry continues to advance, which have increased energy production. The bifacial modules almost always utilize single axis trackers, holding the modules above the ground and track the sun during the day and allowing for the capture of reflected light on the backside of the module. This additional 6 to 10% energy production from the bifacial module is essential for the economics of very competitive utility scale projects. These large bifacial modules are not suitable for use in residential and most commercial installations, where the backside of the module sits closely on the roof, which effectively prevents the backside gain of the bifacial modules and also brings more weight on the roof. Since the safeguard measures were imposed, I've yet to see any US producer offering the 72 cell or comparable panels in a bifacial format for the utility scale segment in a meaningful way. And certainly none have approached EDF Renewables to do so. While there have been some, I'm not aware of any significant volume, as others have testified today. I understand that some US producers have blamed the bifacial exclusion for their failure to adjust to the import competition. But US producers largely ignored this key technology and the utility segment more generally. Before the bifacial exclusion was granted, while the bifacial exclusion was in place, and after President Trump withdrew the exclusion. Given the volume and product demands of the utility scale market, the domestic CSPV industry is capable of supplying only a small sliver of utility scale products, and only then with a suboptimal module. Thus, EDF and other renewable energy utility scale project developers have no choice but to rely on imported panels to support and undertake our projects. Utility scale developers rely on suppliers with individual production capacities, often more than 2 gigawatts per annum, in order to meet the volume requirements for our projects. Extending the safeguard measures and reimposing the duties on bifacial panels would place a tax on solar energy without changing the purchasing patterns of utility scale developers, because the imports often are our only source of reliable supply. Thus, even if the president had the authority to reinstate duties on bifacial panels, despite what Mr. Nicely said on that, doing so would be terrible policy. I would also like to address some of the comments that suggest that the tariffs have not harmed the broader solar industry. The tariffs have had a negative impact on demand. Although this might not always result in a year-over-year decline in demand, demand in the utility market has increased since the imposition of safeguard measures because of things like technological advances or not for the tariffs. Deployment is also not immune to price increases in market and technologies, including wind, natural gas, and other existing generation resources. In our experience, although the demand in the utility market has grown, the tariffs have prevented our firm from installing a number of projects that we could have absent the tariff. Tariffs reduce demand because we have to increase our price and or shift more risk to the potential purchaser of electricity from the solar project to cover the added cost of tariffs to a point where such potential purchasers may not accept those terms. This is even more problematic now with the substantial increase in costs for steel, shipping, and labor, and general supply chain constraints that are greatly hindering the ability of EDF and other solar developers to meet the demand of the utility market to the point where some contracts are being canceled. In response to the TSPC's question regarding the potential ongoing impacts of COVID-19 on the supply chain for solar materials and labor, these adverse impacts will continue at least through third quarter of 2023. Extended safeguards will only exacerbate these and reduce the growth of business for U.S. producers of single axis trackers and other balance of system components, which are manufactured in the U.S., and also U.S. installers, including union electricians, engineers, and other construction workers. Deployment will increase if the pace need continue to decline in order to ensure that solar is competitive with other forms of energy. Extending the safeguard tariffs, especially in bifacial panels, will make it more difficult for solar to compete with other energy sources and will act as a dead weight on demand, particularly during a period where there's already undersupply of such bifacial panels in the US. I emphasize that we're happy for the CSPB cell and module manufacturers to grow and to source some of our supply from within the US. But the way to grow US solar manufacturing is to manufacture along the entire solar supply chain, including polysilicon and wafer production. Incentives like those in SEMA encourage that type of long-term investment, and importantly, do not act as a tax on the broader solar industry. The safeguards, however, are temporary, raise prices for solar cells and modules, suppress demand, and none of the duty collected is invested in the domestic CSPB industry. 4 more years of the tariffs at progressively lower rates will not spur the kind of investment needed for the domestic CSPB producers to become more than a bit player in the utility market. We need more solar. Manufacturing incentives will help achieve that goal. Extending the safeguard tariffs will not. Thank you very much.
George, go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm George Hirschman, CEO of Solve Energy, formerly known as Swinnerton Renewable Energy, based in San Diego, California. Until recently, Swinnerton Renewable Energy was a division of Swinnerton Incorporated, one of the oldest and largest general contractors in the US, with a 130-year history. We carry this legacy with us at Solve Energy as the largest engineering, procurement, and construction firm, or EPC, for utility scale solar in the United States. I was employee number 1 when we started in 2008, and I now represent over 4,000 people working in almost 30 states across the country. We offer turnkey solar power solutions and partner with major utilities and developers to build reliable, clean power. Solve Energy has installed 9.3 gigawatts of solar nationwide. Collectively, we've created 11,000 construction jobs, all high paying and with many union workers. We have a pipeline of over 4.3 gigawatts of solar projects scheduled to begin installation between now and the end of Q3 2022. These projects will span across 20 job sites in 9 states. Solve Energy must have access to imported modules to complete these projects as contracted. You asked about the impact of the safeguard action on the broader US solar industry. In my testimony before the TPSC during the original safeguard investigation and before the International Trade Commission during the extension proceedings, I expressed concern about the negative effects of safeguard tariffs. My concerns have only grown since then as I've seen and experienced the actual impacts of these tariffs firsthand. Over the years, trade restrictions led to slower industry growth, fewer installations, canceled projects, lost revenue, and reduced employment across all sectors of the domestic solar industry. There have been meaningful changes in the US solar industry since the original investigation. The average size of a utility scale solar installation has increased significantly. In 2016 and 17, the average project was only 30 megawatts. 80 megawatts was considered a large project. In 2021, the average project size grew to 150 megawatts. In 2022, it will be 180 megawatts. The size of these projects has a profound impact on local employment. Larger deployments lead to hundreds of additional well-paid local jobs. For example, a 150 megawatt project would make about 200 local hires, but a 500 megawatt project has over 500 local hires. We're providing good paying jobs in rural areas where the ability to have trainable, safe jobs, particularly during COVID, is often very limited. There are also multiplier effects as income is spent in local communities on goods and services, rental equipment, and local suppliers. A continuation of the tariff could mean these jobs wouldn't be created and projects can't be completed as contracted. Since the Section 201 tariff was implemented, several module manufacturers started production in the US, but we continue to use a majority of imported modules. We have seen no significant increase in the utility scale module production capacity, despite what you've heard from US module producers in written comments to this committee. For a number of reasons, domestic module producers cannot supply utility scale demand. Developers and companies like mine that procure modules must mitigate as much risk as possible. We are unable to finance large-scale projects if a majority of a module manufacturer's capacity is being consumed by only one project. This fact should come as no surprise to this committee, as supplier capacity and bankability is not unique to the solar industry. If Solve Energy is contracted to build a 250 megawatt project, we would not be able to procure from a US or any plant that produces 500 megawatts or less, as procuring 50% of a manufacturer's capacity is a high risk and not bankable. Our team and client partners evaluate whether a potential supplier meets a very specific set of qualifications. Does the manufacturer have a sufficient and bankable supply of modules that can be delivered in a timely fashion? Do they meet our high quality and technical specifications? And finally, do they meet our warranty standards? Solve and our developer partners do not purchase CSPV solar modules based on the location of their manufacturer or cost alone. Finally, I challenge what US module producers said about the demand for bifacial in utility projects. In 2021, we installed almost 1 gigawatt of bifacial panels. In 2022 and beyond, we are currently bidding on or under contract for 27 projects totaling almost 5 gigawatts of bifacial panels. In all cases, the developer is using bifacial due to high efficiency and energy yield, as this allows for more efficiency per installed module. Hanwha, Qcell, and LG say there are no technical differences between modules. They are wrong. Lower efficiency monofacial modules are not adequate substitutes, and entire racking systems are engineered around specific types of modules, including the make and model, and are not interchangeable without re-engineering the entire solar plant. Reimposing safeguard tariffs on bifacial panels will have a negative financial impact on these projects and will create general disruption to the US market. Many businesses, including Solve Energy, made decisions based on the assumption that there would be no safeguard duties on these panels. The cost to the utility segment is simply unjustified. For these reasons, I believe an extension of the safeguard measure is not warranted. I ask the President and the administration to listen to the guidance in the safeguard statute that any safeguard action must do more good than harm, not the other way around, as is in this case. Any extension to the 201 would only raise prices, causing self-inflicted inflation in the energy market, and I'm concerned that policymakers continue to ignore the negative impacts this would have on the rest of the solar value chain, including US producers of balance of system components, US installers and EPCs, as well as the US energy consumer. The best option is to not extend the safeguard action. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Aaron Hall, and I am president of Borrego Solar Systems, and I have been personally responsible for module procurement for the last 20 years. According to our industry's leading research and consultancy firm, Wood Mackenzie, Borrego has had the largest market share in the commercial market. Last year, we represented 11% of this market. We are therefore the leader in commercial across our business units, which include EPC services, as well as developing, operating, and maintaining commercial solar projects. We conduct projects for our educational facilities, local and state governments, small and large corporations, water agencies and districts, commercial real estate developers and owners, independent power producers, and investor-owned utilities. Most of our installations are between 1 and 10 megawatts, and we have over 383 commercial projects and over 4 gigawatts of utility scale projects in development through 2025. Our solar projects depend on reliable supply of modules. For this reason, we order directly from manufacturers, which allows us to establish a predetermined delivery schedule for modules. Due to the size of our projects, the timeline for completion is often over several weeks, months, or even years. We can only work with suppliers who are able to meet our supply needs over these longer durations and reserve their future capacity to continue to fill our supply needs. But in our experience, domestic suppliers do not have the capacity or willingness to fill our orders. Our projects use 72 cell monofacial and bifacial modules, neither of which are produced by US producers in significant enough quantities to serve the non-residential, commercial, and utility scale markets. Instead of focusing on large format modules like the 500 plus and 600 plus watt modules used in large commercial or utility scale projects, domestic producers primarily manufacture for residential and small scale commercial projects. During these extension proceedings, proponents of extension have tried to argue that there is little difference between the larger format modules used in large commercial and utility scale projects and the smaller format modules used in residential and small commercial projects. The TPSC also asked SEIA to discuss the limitations of bifacial modules in residential applications. Larger format modules, including bifacial modules, are utterly unsuitable for residential projects. Obviously, 72 cell monofacial modules are larger and weigh more than smaller format modules, and bifacial modules weigh even more because of the double glass that is often used. OSHA requirements prohibit individual workers from handling items that are more than 50 pounds, so residential installers would need to hire more workers to install the larger format modules that weigh significantly more. These labor costs compound in small residential projects. Additionally, residential installers and homeowners generally want to avoid excess weight on a roof for safety and maintenance reasons. Slanted rooftops also have smaller areas for installers to work and often have small or irregular geometry, so residential installers can fit more small format panels into the same surface area. At the ITC hearing, Hanwha and LG both played videos about their operations that clearly show the limitations that residential installers face when installing on rooftops and why bulky, heavy, large format and bifacial panels are inappropriate in these applications. Moreover, even the few domestic producers that do manufacture large format modules cannot meet our needs. Borrego has consistently contacted domestic producers to supply modules, especially in light of the uncertainty in the import market caused by safeguard measures and other tariffs. However, despite our efforts, we have been unable to find domestic producers willing or able to sell to us in any meaningful quantities. In fact, we have had domestic producers expressly decline to sell to us because they have reserved their capacity for the residential market. And we have had domestic producers completely stop responding to our inquiries. Additionally, no US suppliers have consistently maintained Tier 1 status, meaning that banks have confirmed that they are comfortable providing non-recourse debt to projects that utilize modules from these suppliers. This is a key consideration for Borrego, as we want to ensure that the owners and independent power producers that are our customers are able to finance their projects with the modules that we supply. However, because most US producers have chosen to focus on residential projects, they are not Tier 1 certified. We are only aware of 2 US CSPV producers that have reached Tier 1 status, but they have not remained on the list long term, which we and our buyers typically require. Accordingly, even if US producers had the capacity to supply our projects, which they have made clear they do not, almost all have not attempted to show financial institutions, and by extension purchasers like Borrego and its customers, that they are suitable options to supply these large-scale, high-cost projects over long periods of time. We are willing and eager to buy modules from US producers to supply our large commercial projects, which has the added bonus of reducing logistics costs, particularly with supply chain disruptions currently increasing international shipping costs. We also support federal policies that incentivize a strong domestic manufacturing base. But despite almost 4 years of safeguard measures, we still cannot source from domestic manufacturers for large commercial projects, as they have focused most of their efforts on the residential market. And the safeguard measures have slowed critical solar deployment in the significantly larger, large commercial and utility scale segments of the market. Thank you.
Megan. You're on mute, Megan. You're on mute.
Hi, Megan. At this time, you have about 6 minutes left. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good morning. I am Megan Netting, Executive Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Sunnova Energy Corporation. Founded in 2012, Sunnova is a leading residential solar and storage service provider. Sunnova's goal is to be the source of clean, affordable, and reliable energy. We have a simple mission to power energy independence so homeowners have the freedom to live life uninterrupted. We have more than 180,000 customers in 33 US states and territories. Sunnova works exclusively in the residential sector of the market. Sunnova works with over 800 dealers and sub-dealers, many of whom are small businesses who are EPC contractors that handle design, procurement, and installation of residential solar systems. Since Hurricanes Maria and Irma in 2017, Sunnova annually purchases a small quantity of modules to have inventory available for our dealers for hurricane response. I would like to address some misperceptions put forward by US module producers that support extension of the safeguard action. All solar modules are not interchangeable. We have strict technical specifications consistent with residential building codes and the practical limitations of rooftop solar installations. We require lighter weight 60 cell modules with an aesthetically pleasing design, such as triple black, which means black back sheets, black frames, and black cells, and low voltage of 48 to 500 volts. These requirements are distinctly different from commercial and utility projects. We use 60 cell modules for typical rooftop installations because larger modules are more difficult to handle and install on a pitched roof. The roof area is also constrained, requiring fewer solar modules at higher efficiencies. For these reasons, the majority of our dealers simply do not use the 72 cell modules and have no desire to do so. And as a result, the price of 72 cell utility scale modules has no effect on the price of 60 cell rooftop modules. They simply do not compete with each other.
You asked SIA to explain the limitations of bifacial modules in residential applications. Bifacial technology is incompatible with residential installations because roofs are commonly a dark shade that does not permit the added energy generation of a two-sided cell. A very small percentage of residential installations, which are almost entirely in tropical locations, have a white surface. As a result, residential solar systems require monofacial modules. You asked for the percentage of imported bifacial modules used in residential versus commercial applications. The Commission did not collect questionnaire data at this level of detail, but according to the Commission's own research, bifacial modules accounted for only 0.3% of residential installations in 2020 and 0.8% in 2021 for the 5 states with data available. That is at page I-70 of the staff report. Sunnova opposes extension of the safeguard action because any increase in cost for solar installations is a disincentive for customers to install solar. The safeguard also negatively affects American jobs. It is indisputable that more solar deployment means more good paying jobs, particularly in the residential segment that relies on more workers than other segments of the solar industry. The small changes in domestic module supply industry over the last 4 years do not outweigh the increased cost and job loss caused by the safeguard measures. Sunnova is extremely supportive of domestic panel manufacturing. Our dealers purchase panels from domestic manufacturers to the extent that they are available. We've also been very supportive of Senator Ossoff's Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Act, which we believe is the right approach to supporting domestic manufacturing capabilities. The TSPC should also acknowledge the obvious conflict in the position of US module producers regarding extension of the tariff on modules, while also wanting more access to tariff-free imported cells. Sunnova supports termination of the safeguard action in its entirety to ensure a reliable supply of modules, imported and domestic, which can only be achieved by removing these unnecessary trade restrictions. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Megan. That concludes our presentation, Mike and Will, but if I could just mention one other thing, that if it would be helpful, particularly for the court reporter, for Ron and Jamie's testimony, you could tell there were some technical difficulties. So if we need to give you the written testimony to help the court reporter, we'd be happy to do that. With that, turn it back to you.
Thank you to all the participants on this panel, and thank you, Mr. Nicely, for that. We'll consult internally and let you know if we need any written to clean up the transcript. That being said, let's turn to the question and answer session now. Like the first panel, I'll begin. I have a couple hopefully quick questions just to clarify some state of the record, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin and the other panelists to pose any questions that they may have. So my first question is to the American Clean Power Association. And this is just a matter of clarifying the record. One of our advanced written questions to you indicates that at page 4 of your written comments, you argued that economic data presented at the ITC hearing demonstrated that none of the petitioners has produced utility grade products, but instead focus any investment or expansion planning on the more lucrative residential module market. However, in that question, we pointed to statements by Hanwha Q Cells and by Ogden Solar that they have production lines or have produced bifacial products in the United States. I'm hoping you can reconcile your position with the statements of these domestic CSPV producers. For the record, is it that just to clarify, is it that no domestic producer is doing this in your view, or is it more of a question of scale? Thank you.
So thanks for the question, Mike. Just to keep in mind for everyone viewing, I don't have access to the confidential record, so I'm working on publicly available information. And I think the answer is scale. I'm not going to tell you that I don't have access into, as I said, into the confidential record, but it's my understanding from talking to my members and talking to our legal team that the issue of production on the domestic side is, if there is production or there was production or there were sales in the market, they were so small that they were relatively insignificant relative to the scale of the developer needs.
Okay, thanks. And then one other question to ACP as well. I believe I heard you mention in your testimony that this country is dependent on imports of CSPV products, and that is a basis for not continuing the solar safeguard measure. Do you believe that there's any connection between such imports and what the ITC found regarding the state of the domestic industry in its extension review report?
So my point about imports is that I think if you look at the sheer numbers of the panels that our industry will need to move forward with the deployment goals that we have and that the administration has, it's impossible to conceive, even under the most optimistic scenario, that we would have a situation where there weren't some imports. And the reality is that for the domestic manufacturing footprint to grow, and this is really based on testimony that the first panel provided, you're talking scales of a year to 3 to 4 years for people to be able to have capacity come online. And if at the same time we're trying to grow our deployment and really sort of hit the goals that we're trying to hit, there's just no way to do that without some level of import. So I think the question that I'm trying to put before you all is what level of tariff do we want to have on those imports if we want to have any level of tariff?
Okay, thanks for that. And then I have one question to Saya, and that is, you contend that no domestic cell producer can produce bifacial modules, and you emphasize at the scale needed. Do you have any estimate of how much bifacial product production is needed to satisfy U.S. demand?
So I would concur with Vanessa. I don't have access to the confidential record either, but I think you heard from George Hirschman at Solve and other of the developers that this scale, and you heard from Ron at NextEra about how much of their projects are bifacial. But if you think about it, if you listen to their testimony, they have to de-risk their investments, right? So they're not going to buy 100% of the output from one manufacturer. And so as we think about the amount that is growing, I don't have a particular number, but if we think of 20 gigawatts of deployment this year, we think 75% of it is utility scale. We heard from the largest developer that the majority of their projects are bifacial. You can sort of quickly do the math around and then understand that you're not going to buy just from one developer. You have to de-risk that investment. You can pretty quickly get to a very large number.
Thanks for that. I have no further questions, so I'll turn it over to Mr. Martin. Thanks.
All right, I think I am on screen now. I have a few questions. The first two are for Saya. First question to Saya is, does Saya include in its membership any U.S. producers of solar cells or solar modules or polysilicon?
Yes, 100%.
Okay. Second question is, I noted you said that the loss of employment was in 2018 was due to tariffs. Now I look at, this is something from Saya's submission on page 17, shows number of jobs in the US solar industry peaking in 2016, declining in 2017, declining again in 2018 by somewhat less, and then rising in 2019. How is that consistent with your assertion that the safeguard measure resulted in a loss of employment?
I think, Mr. Martin, when you think about a loss of employment, it is both the loss of actual jobs and the loss of jobs that were not created. And I think when we compared our projections of what deployment would be and the resulting employment as a result of that deployment versus what it was in 2017 and 2018, our projections, there's a pretty significant sort of delta there between what could have been and what is. I mean, you are right that over the course of time, our industry has continued to grow, but it is our opinion, and I think our economic analysis shows that the job loss and deployment has been greater because of the imposition of tariffs.
Thank you. All right. My next question, I think it was the gentleman from NextEra who was saying that the ITC had an error in its collection of data for the utility sector. he said that I think the ITC collected its data based on its normal channels of distribution and did not look at utilities. And I want to look into that because that's a pretty serious accusation. It says the ITC ignored what it said, what some participants had alleged. I note here there's table 2.1, which says that the ITC gathered data on assemblers, distributors, residential, commercial, and utilities. So those aren't the ITC's normal channels of distribution. So I don't think that's accurate. Is it your assertion that the ITC defined the utilities channel incorrectly, or is there something I'm missing?
Ron, since we were involved in helping with develop the questionnaires, the ITC, I can answer that. Well, the issue is that this is a case in which it's quite clear to us that, and you can tell from our witness testimony that there are clear segments, different segments that require different kinds of products. And we made this very clear to the ITC throughout, all the way back to the original investigation. And the only extent to which they gathered information about that clear distinction was through their channels of distribution questions, which only had to do with sales. And they asked about distributors. We tried to make it clear that distributors were mostly devoted to selling to the residential sector, but that muddied the water because of the distributor category. In any event, the point is that if they had gathered more information, not just sales information through channels, but production, et cetera, other information about the various segments, what we think of as three large segments, the residential on the one hand, the commercial / industrial on the other hand, and utility scale, they would have had a clearer picture of what was going on and a better understanding of what we are talking about when we distinguish and explain why it is that the industry is really woefully incapable of supplying the largest segment, which is utility scale. So that's, I think, what Mr. Reagan was really speaking to.
All right. Well, this is a really significant point, and I want to be really clear about it so that there's no confusion. So it is your position. Oh, okay, let me ask: is it your position that the utilities data the ITC gathered contains companies that aren't utilities?
Well, when you ask the utilities data, well, there's another issue that I think maybe others can help me with here, which is utilities versus utility scale. But the point is, I think what the ITC was collecting when they said just purely utilities, what they actually meant there was utility scale. But again, we offered, just to be really clear with this, Will, we offered specific definitions of what utility scale means and what the size is, because as George Hirschman talked about in his testimony today, over the last several years, the size of a utility scale project has changed dramatically, right? Going from, around 10 several years ago to as big as 150 on average to what George said next year would be 180 megawatts per project. So that's also something that wasn't captured. What's happened in the market from a dynamic perspective with the size of these projects. And that's important to getting a better sense of whether or not the domestic industry can actually service that part of the market. I mean, let's bear in mind, Auxin, for instance, and publicly available information tells us that Auxin has about 115 megawatts worth of capacity total. Mr. Hirschman talked about how an average utility scale project is 150 megawatts. So that's really the critical issue to recognize here, and what we weren't able to gather in as much detail as we wanted to when the commission didn't accept our proposal for adjusting or adding questions to the questionnaires.
All right, thank you. That's helpful. Last question, and you can decide, Mr. Nicely, whether you want to ask this, whether you want to answer this or refer it to Mr. Hirschman. He said that folks in the selling the utility sector made a number of purchases based on the assumption that there would not be duties on bifacial cells. Now, I note that we granted the bifacial exclusion in June of 2019, and the first withdrawal was in October of 2019. So was it reasonable after October 2019 to rely on the proposition that there would be no duties on bifacial panels?
Well, part of the problem with the yo-yo effect that happened as a result of this litigation was that it was difficult to know whether or not there were going to be duties imposed on these products or not. And part of the goal of these safeguards from the first instance, given that you're imposing these duties on fairly traded products, and the reason why when they're originally announced in the first year, when the president announces them, he actually indicates what the rates will be year by year, is so companies can plan, right? And what has happened with this particular case is it's made it much more difficult for companies to plan in advance. You heard Abby talk about how even for 22 going forward, Woodmac talked about had established what was going to happen in the market, assuming no more safeguard. And now we're in an extension proceeding that is an extraordinary proceeding that nobody expected would happen. And so now they're adjusting their numbers. Now, so I'm getting off topic from what you asked about, but the point is that you need certainty in the market, and we haven't had that here. But George, do you want to speak to that issue of reliance upon what the duties would be or not be going forward?
Sure. So an average utility scale solar project, even when by the time it gets to us, right, as an EPC, a developer has moved that project along for 12 or 18 months on a planning schedule. And then we're another 6 or 8 months out in design before we start construction. So you can easily see where planning began years ago for projects that are slotted for 2022, where the tariff was intended to be stepped completely down. So we absolutely relied on the fact that we were going to be past a 4-year safeguard and that we were not going to be in an extension period. So those projects have been priced both from a PPA standpoint from the developers and from a EPC point of view, priced on buying modules without a tariff imposed in the 201, because the belief is that the 201 would have ended in 2022. And now those projects were priced back in 19 and 20, and let alone the when we talk about the bifacial exemption and then the exemption being reversed, all of those were happening in a period of time where we're continuing to price out projects years in advance.
As an example to that, from a developer perspective, we have executed PPAs with utility off-takers that we executed in 2019 for delivery of products in 2022 and 2023. And we have a fixed contract to deliver that power. And our assumption was that there would be no tariffs at a worst case on bifacial after February 7th, 2027. So we're currently underwater on some of those, if the tariff indeed were extended or reimposed.
All right.
Ron, do you want to add anything further on that, Ron? Ron might be frozen again.
I'll just add that that's definitely the industry perspective. Since the beginning of the process 4 years ago, we've been planning on that it's going to go down 5% every year, and it's going to be gone after the end of 4 years. This is one of those things that has happened 2-3 times in history. We thought, okay, under Trump, yeah, but things will change, and so I'm just telling you that's our perspective, and basically every one of our customers' perspectives is like, okay, we're waiting for February for relief. And utility scale market in particular, 3 cents is not a small thing. And nowadays the tariff's about 6 cents, so it's a huge deal.
All right, thank you very much. I think I have a sense of where you guys are on this, which is very helpful, and I don't want to monopolize the time that's available to us for questions. Have I lost y'all?
Nope. I can hear you, Will.
All right, just wanted to be sure. All right, then I will now turn to my TPSC colleagues to ask if they have any questions. And I see that Dr. Boucher is first in line, so please go ahead.
Yes, and yeah, thank you. Thank you for all of the testimony. Really, it was very interesting. I just wrote my question down here. I want to get it back up on my screen. Okay, so I'm going to direct this to Mr. Swinnerton at Solve Energy, but others can weigh in, of course, if they have answers. And so the question here, I think, riffs a little bit on the last set of questions. You know, will utilities still be able to meet their clean energy goals with the tariffs extended for this 4-year period? And as you answer that question, can you please clarify whether or not this 4 years of a declining safeguard will disadvantage solar as an option for utilities seeking to shift to clean energy sources permanently? Is that the argument that you're making here? Thank you.
Well, I'll take part of this question, and then I think what you probably want to hear is from the developers in the group that actually work directly with the utilities, because in our capacity, we are an EPC contractor, so we build projects for utility developers. And so the more direct question would be to the developers themselves that work with the utilities and understand more closely that business model. I can assure you that from our point of view, at the kind of the final deployment aspect, is that we are seeing less deployment, less contracts moving forward because of if we see a safeguard measure imposed. As we spoke about in the earlier or answer to the previous question, we've made business decisions and priced projects according to a step down or a completion of the safeguard at the end of February, and projects were priced with that tariff level or lack of tariff in place. And so those prices will go up. So we'll have to renegotiate our contracts with developers. Developers will have to try to renegotiate a project with a utility with a fixed price contract, and those projects are now no longer economic. So we're seeing many projects of ours that are on the bubble because of the economics that will change dramatically if a tariff is left in place at its current rate and with a marginal, negligible step down as it's been recommended. So we're seeing that at the very end of the scale, right, of building and deploying projects. But I think Ron or Jamie can speak to the discussions directly with the utilities and what their goals are and being able to meet their goals or lack of being able to meet those.
Yeah, thanks, George, and thanks, Doctor, for the question. So as George said, when we talk to the customers right now, we're still pricing our solar projects, assuming the safeguard measures go away. Our assumption is safeguard measures have only been extended once in history. So, we don't want to price up to our customer something that, historically has not happened. And, our other assumption is if safeguard measures were to be extended, we would still have the bifacial exclusion because, it's been through the courts twice now. And, the judge has found that the bifacial exclusion must remain in place because of liberalization of duties. So at this point, we're still pricing them up at the lower rate. If for some reason, we lose on both of those fronts, then we got to go back and talk to our customers. And like George said, some of these projects likely go away because our customers are not going to be willing to pay a higher price for solar projects.
Well, another example related to that, and I agree with those comments, is we sometimes are seeking to, our customers need us to get below their avoided costs of energy. So there's a pretty clear target price to hit. And if we lose on one or two of those things that Ron mentioned, we're just in many cases not going to be able to hit that mark and the project won't go forward. So there'll definitely be, for the utilities to meet their clean energy goals, will definitely be significantly held back if we lose on, if one or two of these variables were to go against us.
To your point about permanency, I don't know that there'd be a permanent impact of a short-term tariff, but if we're thinking about cost and benefit, I just want to remind you that the goals for the Biden administration and of course the solar industry are very aggressive, and 4 years of hamstringing that growth will have a long-term impact and prevent us from achieving those goals. And that's, I think, important to keep in mind. We don't have 10 years to kind of slowly play this game to get where we want to be.
Thank you. Willis, I'll turn it back to you as we're running out of time.
All right, next question I see is from Mr. Mrochka. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Will. You all mentioned, this is for pretty much everybody, but I suspect Ron will probably take the first crack at the apple. You all mentioned that a tariff will just be an increase in prices. As you all know, tackling inflation is a serious issue for this administration. We've already seen a significant impact that what a tariff increase can have on an input and will have on inflation with ammonium nitrate and food prices, which is a main contributor to inflation. Do you all have any sense on what an extension of the tariffs would contribute to inflation? Would it move the needle at all, or would the impact be minimal?
Yeah, so I'll start. So, if the extension were at 15%, that directly translates to $2 to $3 a megawatt hour on the price.
Looks like we lost Ron again. Does anybody else want to take this on?
Well, if you look at just from a
Ron,
bill,
Ron, are you back? We lost you for a little bit there. We lost you.
Yeah,
We heard you say
I
$2
can hear you now.
to $3 a megawatt hour, and then we lost you.
Oh, sorry. So the market today for solar PPAs is $20 to $30. So you're talking about 10% increase in the price of a solar PPA if the safeguard measures get extended.
and from a build cost, modules still make up roughly 50% of the cost of a utility scale project. So if you have 15% tariff, you've got 7.5% of just raw cost that go into to the additional cost of building a solar project. And then you compound those on top of historically high shipping costs, a number of other inflationary costs within the overall project build, and you can see that the projects quickly become uneconomic.
All right.
Victor, I think there's one thing to bear in mind here. Prices have indeed fallen, notwithstanding the tariffs over the last several years. But again, we're talking about opportunity cost and what doesn't get billed because those prices haven't fallen enough. But we're also critically talking about what I think you just heard about is the situation right now, given the additional costs that everyone is facing, is that we're seeing this industry is actually experiencing that kind of inflationary effect.
All right, thank you. Dr. Gorman, you have a question?
I do, thank you. And I'll pose this to all the panelists, so feel free to respond as you see fit. We've learned a lot during COVID about the risks in global supply chains for critical industries, and in particular, the heavy reliance by any one industry on production in any one part of the world, and the risk of disruption that this can cause. And I think, as all of you are aware, the administration has been working to assess risks in a number of sectors that are vital to our economic recovery and our broader climate goals. So I'm just curious, how do you think about balancing cost versus managing risk in your supply chains? And has recent experience with COVID-related disruptions changed your thinking at all, whether it's regards to a diversity of supply or de-risking your operations? If it has changed, I'm curious how.
I can start. This is Ron Reagan with NextEra. Yes, we have looked at it very seriously, and our big goal at this point is to get more of the module manufacturers to move their production to the United States. So we've talked to the top 5 module manufacturers in the world, and we've asked them point blank, what's it going to take for you to move to the US? And all of them have told us they need the incentives that are in the Build Back Better Act. They want legislation. They want certainty. Safeguard measures are not certainty. Safeguard measures can change day to day with the stroke of a pen by the president. None of them are going to bring their capital investment to the United States when the rules can change from one president to the next president. They want legislation. They want it written. They want long-term incentives. And that's what Build Back Better is going to give us. And that's really what we've been working hard for, is to get these top 5 or 6 folks to bring their operations here to the US. And I think we're on the cusp of making that happen.
I just want to add that China is the name on the headline from the other side of who we need to attack and defend against, our energy independence and everything. But the fact that we now are getting modules from half a dozen to a dozen Southeast Asian countries, as well as other countries around the world, including on this hemisphere, is a good thing for diversifying our supply. And when factories in Cambodia were shut down, we could get stuff from Vietnam or Thailand and vice versa. And so, basically high level, I just want to say putting a tariff on the whole world, which is what this tariff does, except with 1 or 2 exceptions in the world, does not help the diversity of supply of solar modules in the United States at all. And of course, we don't believe the safeguard is necessarily the answer to get the domestic manufacturing piece of that puzzle solved either.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Jones-Albertus, you have a question?
Thank you, and thank you to all of the panelists. I know we heard from each of the individual developers how the increase in costs related to the tariff would cause you to need to re-examine your projects. My question is for SIA and ACP. Do you have any aggregated estimates across the industry of what a continued remedy, if the recommendation by the ITC is put forward in aggregate, what that would mean for solar deployment? Matt, do you know if we have? I can't think of one. Thanks, Dr. Jones-Albertus. Are you aware of one that we've put in our testimony? I'm not aware of one.
No. Sorry, the impact that it would have
if they were continued.
Yeah, I mean, what we talked about are the costs to the consumer, and that's set forth in our comments, which are obviously significant, and given the amount of duties that would be collected, and the assumed or the planned for additional manufacturing that would happen in the module sector, the amounts that we'd be paying for each individual module making job would be massively higher than even the first 4 years. Okay. But that's the kind of analysis we did in our comments. We didn't do the other what you're specifically asking about.
Yeah, I would just, Becca, I'm sure you're aware of this, but what I would point out is what I talked about in my testimony, which is the most recent projections, even just for 22, that included a 25% decrease in deployment in 2022 without the assumption that these tariffs would continue. And then sort of the imperial the stories that the developers have told about the incredible impact that additional cost will have. But I think that a 25% decrease in projections over just a couple of months, right? From in our projections tells you how truly sensitive the market is to those kinds of additional costs.
Vanessa, did you want to add anything?
I think the only thing I would add is that we're talking headwinds on headwinds on headwinds for the industry, right? I mean, at some point, solar just becomes disfavored, and I think there's been some testimony to that effect. That the developers have talked about how at some point projects just don't get built, and when projects don't get built, it takes a long time for someone to decide to rebuild it. So you're just talking about further and further putting our goals of reaching the deployment goals the administration has set are getting further and further out of reach, and it's just one more headwind for the industry.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Brewer, you had a question?
No, sorry. I'm sorry. No, I didn't have a question. Sorry, I hit the button by accident.
No problem. All right, Mrs. Sandras, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Will, and thank you everyone for your testimony today. I'm going to direct this question to Ms. Nutting with Sonova, though I'm sure other folks may want to jump in. I'm going to revert back to our advanced questions. You noted certain bifacial module limitations in residential applications, such as the sloped roof and the darker color of the roof. And I'm wondering if if something such as a carport or a ground mount system or an awning that may already exist in a residential setting would resolve some of those limitations.
It could potentially. We don't do carports, ground mounts. We do rooftops at homes, along with storage. So for our applications, our almost 200,000 customers, bifacial panels aren't something we would use.
Also, I can comment on that a bit because we've done some carports and yeah, you could have carports for the bifacial module might work, but that's going to be such a small drop in the bucket compared to the utility scale. I mean, a big carport is 1 or 2 megawatts, just to put it in perspective. So
even sticking in within residential, forget about utility scale. A carport percentage of the market versus rooftop has got to be in a single-digit percentage.
Yeah,
probably less than 1%. It's not a thing. It's, yes, you could see one in a city maybe, but not like 2 on a block.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was my only question, Will.
All right, thank you. Do we have any, I don't want to cut things off just because of the schedule. Do we have any more questions from our interagency colleagues? Please raise hands if you do. All right, I don't see any. I'm going to take advantage of my chair's prerogative and ask one last question, then I'll direct Mr. Nicely, you direct it wherever you think most fitting. Our friends in the first panel, many of them said that if the bifacial exclusion continues, any extension would have no effect whatsoever. Do you agree with that view?
Absolutely not. I mean, and by the way, I'm glad you asked that, Will. I mean, we did detailed analysis of the best data that we could, comparing 72 cell to 60 cell. Had Tom Prusha from Rutgers University do that analysis to see what the relationship was, and he discovered that in fact there was not the kind of relationship that these folks are suggesting there is. And in fact, by the way, they say the bottom fell out on the pricing. Prices have been falling every single year, as everybody knows. Swanson's law tells you that prices are going to fall, and they have done just that, notwithstanding the safeguard. And the extent of the price decline that happened even in the year of when the bifacial panel exclusion was granted, the decline was the same that it had been previously. And so as a result, there isn't the proof, either including from using economic tools. There wasn't the proof to show that there was a relationship between the bifacial panel exclusion and what was happening with pricing in the marketplace. So no, we don't think there's going to be the same effect. We think that bifacial, by and large, bifacial is being used in the utility scale segment where this industry, by and large, is not servicing that industry. And we've all talked about how Hanwha is using one of its lines for that industry, and it's able to serve a small, very, very small portion. And in fact, Ron has talked about how he has purchased from them before. But the fact is that there is so little available for that industry, for that segment of the industry from the domestic producers, that as a result, you're going to import anyway. And so if they're able to import bifacial panels, which is what most of them are using these days, because that's where they get the greatest efficiency, we don't see the effect that they suggest is going to happen. Does anybody else want to? That? I guess not.
I think that answers the question. And we are, I believe, past when we said we were going to close down. So, Mike, what do we have for our time to resume with panel 3?
Thanks, Will. The notional schedule indicates that we would resume at 1 o'clock based on an end time of 12:20 for panel 2. So a 40-minute lunch break, but I would defer to you on how much of a break you want to provide before we resume. I was thinking maybe 1:15.
1:15 sounds logical.
Okay.
Yes. All right. So we will resume at 1:15. I will see a new set of faces, but I hope those of you who can listen in to the extent you find it interesting. So with that, we'll close out panel 2 and thank
Good afternoon and welcome back. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. We will now continue this public hearing regarding the solar safeguard extension review, and we'll proceed to panel 3. Panel 3 will comprise Mr. Jonathan Stoll of Hogan Lovells US LLP. Then we'll hear from Silfab Solar Incorporated, then Helion Incorporated, then Canadian Solar Solutions, and finally from Maxion Solar Technologies Limited. The participants on this panel have a combined 45 minutes to testify. Based on prior communications with them, we will start with Mr. Stoll and then proceed to Silfab, Helion, and Canadian Solar. They have a combined 30 minutes to testify. From there, we'll move to Maxion, who has 15 minutes to testify. We'll then turn it to question and answers from the panel. As of this morning, Ms. Ronalda Smith from USTR will be keeping your time, and she will indicate when you have 2, 1, and no minutes remaining. Similar to this morning, we request that you state your name and title before proceeding for purposes of the transcript. Mr. Stoll, are you ready?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, please proceed. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify today to the committee. My name is Jonathan Stoll. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells, representing the Government of Canada and also Canadian industry in this extension proceeding. I'll be leading off this afternoon's panel of Canadian and Mexican industry witnesses. I'll be followed by representatives of the 3 companies representing the Canadian solar industry: Paolo Macario of Silfab Solar, Martin Paktarik of Helion Inc., and Vincent Ambrose of Canadian Solar Solutions. Our final witness will be John Magnus of Tradewinds, representing Maxion for the Mexican solar industry. We look forward to answering your questions at the conclusion of our testimony. The Canadian solar industry sits before you today as a proud partner of the U.S. solar industry and a strong supporter of the administration's Build Back Better agenda, including specifically its efforts to transition the U.S. economy to green energy and to combat climate change. Helion and Silfab employ hundreds of American manufacturing workers at 4 facilities in 3 states: Florida, Minnesota, and Washington State. And they will soon have the capacity to produce 1.7 gigawatts of solar modules right here in the USA. Canadian Solar has invested more than $1 billion in the United States as a leading US utility-scale solar
an energy storage project developer with a project development portfolio of over 4 gigawatts of solar energy generation and 9 gigawatts of battery storage projects. The company is completing detailed due diligence on the feasibility of investments in U.S. solar manufacturing. I would like to make 3 points today to the committee this afternoon. First, if the president determines to extend the safeguard measures to Canada, it should both grant an exclusion to Canada and terminate or expand substantially the tariff rate quota, or TRQ, currently being applied to U.S. imports of solar cells. Second, consistent with U.S. law, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and the material facts, the committee should recommend to the president that Canada be excluded from any extended safeguard measure. And finally, the president should either eliminate or expand substantially the TRQ currently being applied to U.S. imports of solar cells. I would now like to turn to why U.S. law permits the president both to exclude Canada from any extended safeguard measure and also to eliminate or expand substantially the TRQ on solar cells. First, the text of the Safeguard Extension Statute, 19 U.S.C. Section 2253 E1B, is sparse and places few constraints on the president's authority to extend the safeguard measure. If the president finds that the 2 prescribed conditions have been met, this part of the law simply limits the total duration of the safeguard measure to 8 years. There is no prohibition on the president's authority to craft the specifics of an extended safeguard measure. This statutory conferment of broad safeguard extension authority on the president is reinforced by Section 203A3I of the Trade Act of 1974, which directs the president to, quote, take any action which may be considered by the president under the authority of law and which the president considers appropriate and feasible. The president's broad authority to craft safeguard measures has also been recognized in several contexts by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and the Court of International Trade. Indeed, relying on this broad delegation of authority, President Trump determined in the recent washer's extension measure to exclude imports from Canada and imports from a lengthy list of developing countries. My second point is that Section 203D5 of the Trade Act provides an extended safeguard action, like an original safeguard action, quote, shall be phased down at regular intervals during the period in which the extended action is in effect. This requirement would be met if the president determines both to exclude certain countries, such as Canada or Mexico, from the safeguard measure, and also to eliminate or substantially expand the TRQ for solar cells. This is because both a country-specific exclusion and the elimination or expansion of the TRQ would be, quote, trade liberalizing, unquote, actions by the president vis-a-vis the safeguard measures currently in place. With respect to the exclusion of Canada from an extended safeguard measure, there are 2 additional reasons why the committee should recommend such an action to the president. 1, the Canadian solar industry is very small, and its exports to the United States have been minuscule and remained stable over the past 4 years. As a consequence, and in response to the committee's advanced question of the government of Canada, the share of Canadian exports to the United States has declined as a share of U.S. market demand for solar products and as a share of total imports. Furthermore, none of the 3 Canadian solar producers appearing before you today has plans to expand production capacity in Canada, a logical outcome of the fact that today, the cost of producing solar products is lower here in the United States than in Canada. Before you today are the only 3 Canadian solar panel producers and exporters. As such, there is no threat that material quantities of solar panels will be exported from Canada to the United States in the foreseeable future. 2, the United States' international obligations under the USMCA mandate an exclusion for Canada based on these facts. In fact, the current U.S. imposition of a safeguard tariff on Canadian solar modules is unlawful. The Safeguard Chapter of the USMCA, which is reflected in the USMCA Implementation Act, mandates the exclusion of imports from a USMCA country, in this case, Canada, from a U.S. safeguard measure unless imports constitute a substantial share of U.S. imports and contribute importantly to the serious injuries suffered by U.S. producers of solar products. As I've already explained, the minuscule volume of Canadian exports of solar products does not constitute a substantial share of U.S. imports. This is confirmed by the fact that Canada is not one of the top 5 exporters to the United States. Moreover, imports from Canada do not contribute importantly to the challenges confronted today by U.S. solar manufacturers. In fact, as you will hear from our witnesses, the exact opposite has occurred. Canadian manufacturers, Helion and Silfab, are together the second largest manufacturer of solar products in the United States. And both companies have detailed for the committee, and will again today, their exciting concrete plans for further expansions of their U.S. production operations. As a consequence, every dollar of safeguard tariff paid by these Canadian producer exporters curtails their ability to invest in additional solar production and accompanying manufacturing jobs here in the United States. If the president were to lift the tariff on imports from Canada, the consequence will be millions of dollars of additional investments in solar manufacturing here in the United States. Finally, I must reinforce that the president should avoid imposing a punitive tax on U.S. solar module manufacturers that likewise will inhibit Canadian investments to develop a U.S. solar supply chain. The solar cell TRQ was exhausted in 2021, and U.S. solar module manufacturing is set to expand even further in 2022. As a consequence, if the committee recommends that the president extend the safeguard, it should also recommend that the 2.5 gigawatt TRQ on solar cells be enlarged significantly or eliminated altogether. That is, no tariff should be imposed on solar cells destined for U.S. solar manufacturing of modules. Both Helion and Silfab must import solar cells in order to run their U.S. manufacturing plants, to employ their American workers, and to expand their U.S. production capacities. Solar module manufacturing is inherently a low-margin business, and neither company can afford another unnecessary tax on their American-made solar panels. Thank you again. Our next witness is Paolo Macario of Silfab.
Thank you. Good afternoon and Happy New Year. My name is Paolo Macario. I'm the President and CEO of Silfab Solar Inc., a solar module producer based in Ontario, Canada, and of Silfab Solar Washington, a module producer located in the state of Washington. I am here today to request that imports from Canada are excluded from the safeguard measure. Our small and stable imports of solar module from Canada complement our growing U.S. manufacturing. Indeed, our Canadian and our U.S. production are intertwined, and arm to Silfab on one side of the border arms our business on the other side. On the other hand, if the tariff is removed, Silfab will invest millions more dollars in U.S. production instead of paying the tariff. Furthermore, if the TPSC recommends that the president extend the safeguard measure, it should also recommend to increase the TRQ on solar cells to avoid imposing a harsh tariff on U.S. module manufacturers like Silfab. A new tax on our U.S. manufacturing in the form of a safeguard tariff on cells would directly harm our U.S. manufacturing operation, the largest buyer of non-self-produced cells. I am quite excited about the success of Silfab growing U.S. business. Since 2018, we have invested in U.S. solar manufacturing and created the second largest manufacturing footprint for CSPV modules in the United States. Silfab first invested in a solar manufacturing facility in Washington in 2018, saving the jobs of workers at the almost bankrupt high-tech facility. We have since invested substantially more in that facility, significantly increased capacity, and grown employment. In August 2021, Silfab opened its second U.S. solar manufacturing facility in Burlington, Washington, creating American manufacturing jobs and doubling Silfab U.S. production capacity. We currently employ more than 270 Americans, and we have big plans to further expand our U.S. operations, make additional investment, and hire more U.S. workers. We are very proud to be a major part of the American green energy future, but I want to make very clear a few points. First, that our business plan is entirely predicated on Canada being excluded from the Section 201 tariffs. Second, that our plan is based on no or an increased TRQ on cells. Third, that unlike other panelists, our plan is not only on paper, but with location, building, equipment, and hiring contracts for people ready to be signed. The continued health of Silfab Canadian manufacturing business is vital to our U.S. production operation in Washington. Silfab Canadian operation facilitate investment and research that have benefited our U.S. business, The safeguard takes away from our ability to continue investing millions of planet dollars in US manufacturing. Quite simply, the tariff on imports from Canada makes it more difficult for us to continue to expand our US production capacity or increase our American hiring. If the tariff is removed, we could pour millions upon millions of dollars into the green economy in the United States. This should be quite an easy decision for you. Silfab has a long history of partnering with the US solar industry. There is no cell production in Canada, so we are required to import cells into Canada to make modules. So we used to partner with Saniva to procure cells for our modules. Our Canadian business was one of Saniva's biggest customers in 2015 before Saniva went out of business. We were frequently ordering larger quantities of cells from Saniva that they could even provide to us. Unfortunately, we encountered problems receiving enough cells on time. We also experienced quality problem, and then Saniva business failed and stopped supplying us altogether in 2016. We wanted to buy cells from the United States then, and we still would buy today from the United States if cells were available. But unfortunately, there are no cells in all of North America for purchase and no cell production coming online in the immediate future. And even if it was, it would certainly be unable to make the type and format of cells Silfab needs in terms of size of the wafers or in time of back contact cells. This is why it's very important that if the safeguard is extended, then the TRQ on cells is also expanded or eliminated altogether. We cannot expand at the pace we are planning for 2022 and beyond if we are forced to pay a punitive tax on our major input, the solar cell. It is unfortunate that certain US competitors have asked the TPSC to recommend arming Silfab on both sides of the border. One of the companies, Saniva, previously failed to meet Silfab requirement for solar cells, as I've already explained, and subsequently hasn't produced a single solar cells over the last 5 years. On the other hand, Silfab has delivered on its promise to expand solar manufacturing in the United States. Another competitor, without citing any evidence, calls our imports of small quantities of module from Canada as pernicious. This is absurd. There are only 2 companies opposing an exclusion for Canada and seeking a tariff on imports of solar cells, which fuel our module business in the US. I hope the TPSC see through those companies' rhetoric and understand that imports from Canada have never been large and have never been harmful to the US industry. Moreover, until there is a sufficient supply of solar cells, we need tariff-free cells, access to imported those cells in order to support the solar manufacturing in the United States. Silfab is ready and willing to work together with the US government to build the full solar manufacturing supply chain in the United States. We have detailed our big plans in our confidential written comments. Tariff on cells or imports from Canada are counterproductive to those goals. The TPSC should recommend that President Biden do what is best for American manufacturing and our green energy future. If the TPSC recommends the extension of the safeguard measure, then it also recommends the exclusion of Canada and an expansion or elimination altogether of the TRQ on solar cells. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer all of your questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Martin Pochtaruk, and I'm the president of Helian. We manufacture solar modules in our facilities in the United States and Canada. I'm here today for 2 reasons. First, I request that the TPSC recommend that the safeguard tariff is removed on imports from Canada. Imports of solar modules from Canada do actually benefit the US solar industry. The small imports of solar modules from Canada are part of a North American supply chain that supports manufacturing through increased research and development, technical know-how, and investment dollars flowing from Canada to the United States. Second, it is critical that the solar cells continue to be duty-free, as Paolo Macario from Silfab was just saying. If the president extends the safeguard tariff without increasing the TRQ on cells or eliminating it entirely, that will be devastating for Helian and the rest of US module manufacturing industry. I would like to provide a bit of background on Helian and our commitment to manufacturing solar panels in the United States and Canada. Helian began manufacturing solar modules in Canada in 2010. And 4 years ago, due to the safeguard, the solar modules manufactured in Canada that were primarily exported to the United States had to be curtailed. Canadian modules were qualified by the U.S. Department of Defense for various projects, including the Army and the Navy since 2014. Prior to the safeguard, Helion also invested in a laminate facility in Minnesota that was previously operated by a company that went out of business. When the safeguard was imposed in 2018, as I was saying, Helion shuttered the Minnesota laminate operation and reduced the Canadian production. In April of 2018, Helion decided, repivoting on the safeguard decision, to reinvest in a new manufacturing facility in Minnesota, investing then $21 million and hiring 90 American workers. Our Minnesota production capacity in that building continues to be at 150 megawatts. Back in September, we started construction for an additional factory on the same site for another 400 megawatts through an investment that also consists of $21 million. This expansion will create yet another 60 jobs for that one location in Minnesota. Prior to this, in the month of July, we opened a second manufacturing facility in Riviera Beach, Florida, after upgrading the 100 megawatt capacity production line that was previously operated by SolarTech Universal. We began producing high-efficiency heterojunction cell modules out of that location 1 month ago. This has created an additional 60 good-paying jobs for the clean energy manufacturing industry in the US. We are planning at this time to add on the Florida facility a 250 megawatt manufacturing line that will be in place by the beginning of Q4. These two expansions, the one in Minnesota and the one in Florida that I just mentioned, will position Helion at a 900 megawatt or slightly over 900 megawatts and slightly over 200 jobs within Minnesota and Florida. Our story is one of success, but even in face of immense challenges. Many US manufacturers such as SolarWorld, SunPower, Panasonic, and Tesla have all shattered since the safeguard entered into effect. Suniva, as Paolo was saying, has been out of business for the last 5 years. Helion, on the other hand, has expanded our US production capacity by leaps and bounds, overcoming several challenges along the way, including, which is something that I think is worth mentioning and reminding everybody, Section 301. Section 301 tariffs is actually making our materials inputs more expensive and penalizing US manufacturing of solar modules. On top of that, we have had the global supply chain crisis and COVID-19. So there has been no lack of entertainment for sure. In addition, other US manufacturers such as Hanwha, LG, and Jinko do have their own cell manufacturing in Asia. While in our case, we suffer the logistical disadvantage of needing to purchase foreign-made solar cells. As we mentioned already, and let me emphasize, the safeguard tariff on imports from Canada has harmed Helion's operations on both sides of the border. This is because Helion USA depends on capital and know-how from Helion Canada. Helion Canada has suffered from reduced sales and profitability as a result of the safeguard, limiting its ability to provide capital to Helion USA. In turn, this has slowed Helion USA's ability to invest further in US solar manufacturing. Quite simply, the tariff imposes a burdensome tax on Helion that reduces our US investment dollar, keeps us from hiring more US workers, and thwarts our production of more US-made solar panels. For these reasons, if the TPSC recommends extension of the safeguard measure, then it should also recommend that imports from Canada be excluded. In addition, if the TPSC recommends that the President extends the safeguard, it should also recommend that the TRQ on solar cells be expanded significantly or eliminated altogether. The TRQ is nearly exhausted for this year, as it was mentioned already. We will soon need to pay the safeguard tariff on solar cells. So let me say it again and repeat myself by saying that there is no near-term availability of US sales. So Helion is required to import cells to run our factories and to support the jobs of American workers. If the TRQ stays at 2.5 gigawatts next year, and we're forced to pay the tariff, then this will simply stifle our progress over the last 4 years. And by our progress, I mean not only Helion, but the entire US solar panel manufacturing industry. We will be forced to slow our expansion plans. We're already running on thin margins and simply cannot afford another tax on American-made solar panels. And as I mentioned, the 301 safeguard among them. Finally, I'm compelled to say something about the highly inaccurate comments of two of my US competitors, particularly Galling, is that these two companies urged TPSC not to expand the TRQ for solar cells that is essential to the financial viability of Helian and other US solar module producers. One of these companies hasn't ever made a solar cell, and the other one hasn't made a single solar cell in 5 years. And when they were making them, they weren't even good. This is an industry where the technology improves every month. Helian and his workers have been manufacturing solar panels here in the United States over the last 4 years, and in Canada for 11. In the face of immense challenges, we have expanded and succeeded. Do not impose an unnecessary tax on blossoming American manufacturers of solar modules on the basis of these unfounded comments. Moreover, both companies argue that there is something of theoretical harm caused by imports from Canada. And as Paolo just commented, one of them calls these imports pernicious. If you haven't noticed, I'm outraged by these comments. Imports from Canada have always been tiny, and no other competitor opposes an exception from Canada. And as I already explained, maintaining the tariff on US imports from Canada would only serve to punish Helian with millions of dollars of investments and hundreds of US workers that work for Helian and actually make solar panels. Thank you, and I'll be pleased to answer your questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Vincent Ambrose. I'm the General Manager for North America of Canadian Solar Incorporated. Canadian Solar is a global solar company headquartered in Ontario, Canada. We have invested about $1 billion in the US solar industry. We are responsible for many gigawatt hours of deployment of utility scale solar energy across the United States through Recurrent Energy, which is our US solar development arm. We also have roots in Canada, hence our name. Our Canadian manufacturing facility, Canadian Solar Solutions, Inc., is located in Guelph, Ontario, and produces very small quantities of solar modules, not solar cells. Canadian Solar today produces very few solar modules in Canada. Our US imports of solar modules manufactured in Canada declined prior to the Commission's initial safeguard investigation and have continued to decline since the imposition of the safeguard measure in 2018. This was primarily due to high production costs in Canada that have caused the Guelph facility to no longer be commercially viable and competitive. We have thus shifted our Canadian operations primarily towards research and development and have been forced to reduce significantly our Canadian workforce and our production capacities. Today, Canadian Solar has no business plans to import commercial quantities of CSPV modules from Canada into the United States in the foreseeable future. This is irrespective of whether the safeguard measure is extended beyond February 22. And these plans are highly unlikely to change. In 2017, the Commission recommended the exclusion of US imports of solar products from Canada from the President's safeguard measure. That was the correct recommendation. And yet, President Trump ignored the Commission's recommendation. President Biden now has the opportunity to fix President Trump's mistake and issue an exclusion for Canada. Finally, I'd like to address some of the statements made by Suniva in its written submission to the TPSC. Suniva argues that because Canadian Solar manufactures in Asia, that its small Canadian operations are a threat to the US industry. This is just false. Our Canadian operations are very small, and there is no evidence that our Canadian manufacturing arm could harm the US industry. As you've heard from Helene and from Silfab, the exact opposite is actually true. Removing the tariffs on imports from Canada would actually benefit the US industry. For these reasons, I ask that the TPSC recommend to the President that imports from Canada be excluded from the safeguard measure. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer any of your questions.
I guess that's me now. Good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm John Magnus from TradeWinds LLC, appearing for Maxion. We appreciate this opportunity to testify. Maxion spun out of SunPower in August 2020 and is a global CSPV solar manufacturer. It is currently assembling interdigitated back contact panels in Mexico, IBC, for the US market, and has announced plans to resume assembling shingled cell panels in Mexico for the US market. Maxion has also announced its intention to produce CSPV cells and modules in the United States. This is a plan to produce at scale 3 gigawatts a year of both cells and modules. The 3 gigawatts per year ModCo would be nearly twice as large as the largest existing US ModCo, the Q-Cells facility in Dalton, Georgia. I can't compare the 3 gigawatt per year cell fab to any existing US cell production because there is none. I'll have some more detail in a moment on our concrete progress with respect to that manufacturing investment. We have two messages today. First, Mexico should be excluded if the safeguard measure is extended. And second, an extended safeguard measure should not apply to unassembled CSPV cells. I'll start with Mexico, and I'll answer the committee's prepared questions as I go. I'm going to try to do a screen share here. This worked yesterday, so I hope it will also work today. Some statistics. These are based on data web data rather than the confidential figures developed by the ITC in its extension investigation, but the percentages are valid. Over the 4-year period preceding the safeguard measure, 2014 to 2017, imports from Mexico accounted for roughly 1/10 of total US imports in the relevant tariff category. By 2020, after a couple of years of safeguard relief, imports from Mexico had declined so much that they accounted for just 1% of total US imports. Essentially, all of what you see here in the Mexico line since 2017 comes from Maxion's factories. What this means is that the small remaining flow from Mexico to the United States consists entirely of exempt IBC modules. IBC modules have never been made in the United States. They command market prices well above those of conventional CSPV modules. These small numbers speak for themselves. In practical terms, Mexico is not and could not possibly be part of an import competition problem for the US industry. Legally, imports from Mexico are well below the threshold for current coverage, much less extended coverage in the safeguard measure. For example, and referencing the NAFTA USMCA criteria that Jonathan spoke about, Mexico is not among the top 5 suppliers, and imports from Mexico have been falling in absolute terms, while total US imports have been growing. Accordingly, if the safeguard measure is extended, Mexico should be exempted from it. I should add that the trade compensation owed to Mexico, given its historic share of US imports during the pre-safeguard period, is in the neighborhood of $1 billion a year. Under NAFTA and now USMCA, Mexico has an automatic right to suspend concessions at that same level and as much as compensation isn't being provided. It's a big bilateral trade relationship, but suspended concessions of that magnitude would not likely go unnoticed. The committee has asked why, if our IBC panels assembled in Mexico already benefit from a product exclusion, why would we support a country exclusion for Mexico? The committee also asked whether our announced plans to ramp up production in Mexico involve IBC panels or covered products. As publicly announced, Maxion's expanded production in Mexico will not involve excluded IBC products. Rather, it will feature shingled cell panels. The shingling technology, although proprietary, uses conventional CSPV cells, and it falls inside the safeguard measures. Product coverage, excluding Mexico, is critical. And even with Maxion's expanded shingle cell panel production, shipments from Mexico will remain far below the legal threshold that I referenced moments ago for maintaining Mexico's coverage under a global safeguard measure. This ties directly to one of the questions posed to the government of Mexico by the committee, asking whether a reduction in installed capacity to produce modules might be responsible for the decrease in imports of modules from Mexico to the United States. It appears that the drafter of this question has the cause and effect reversed, at least as it relates to Maxion. Our decision to stop producing shingled cell CSPV products in Mexico was made in part because the US safeguard measure made it uneconomic to continue assembling these products in Mexico for sale in the US market. With the end of the safeguard measure, or Mexico's coverage under that measure, approaching, Maxion now plans to reinstate production of shingled cell modules in the same facility. That's the first point, exclude Mexico. Second point has to do with unassembled cells. And our message here rests on the premise that in assessing the domestic industry's adjustment, the committee should focus on the industry that exists today. The U.S. industry trying to adjust is a module assembly industry. The failure of prior U.S. cell fabs, none of which was built, much less operated anywhere near its scale, can't be considered surprising. In any event, closing uneconomic facilities and exiting uneconomic segments are consistent with, actually, they are a form of positive adjustment, as that term is defined in the safeguard statute. We respectfully submit that in this extension review, the committee should not indulge in nostalgia or in blue sky industrial policy musing. Rather, its task is tightly framed as determining whether safeguard relief remains necessary in the context of positive adjustment. This requires staying focused on the ModCo industry and its near-term needs. One of those needs is an unconstrained supply of duty-free unassembled cells. The committee is asked by how much we recommend expanding the TRQ. For the reasons already stated, we see no reason to have import relief on unassembled cells at all. If it's going to continue, the allowance for duty-free entries should expand by at least enough to cover all existing and announced ModCo capacity in the United States. The committee also asked about concrete steps Maxeon has taken to begin cell production in the United States, when it's expected to start, and whether Maxeon would be supplying cells only to its own module factory. I can report in this public setting 4 things. First of all, site selection is very well advanced. It's down to 3 locations. Maxeon's application to the Energy Department's Loan Programs Office is also advancing well. The expected operational date for the cell line is early 2024, of course, subject to final site selection, passage of SEMA, and successful project financing. And lastly, Maxeon plans to internally consume the entire 3 gigawatts per year of cell production. The committee's last question is whether we really are confident that import relief on unassembled cells would not help on its own to facilitate cell production in the United States. And the answer is yes. After intensive review, that is our confidently held view. Import relief on cells does not provide sufficient incentive for Maxeon or, in our view, any other large-scale CSPV producer to implement U.S. cell production. If import relief were going to catalyze production of cells in the United States, that would have happened already. As for Maxeon, our planned U.S. cell-making investment is SEMA contingent. It is not import relief contingent. In conclusion, the case for excluding Mexico is unassailable. The case for excluding unassembled cells is also compelling in our view. We thank the committee for allowing us to testify and look forward to fielding any additional questions that you might have.
Thank you very much to everybody for your testimony. So we'll now go into the question and answer session. And I thought I would start by following up on a few of the prepared questions that we had sent in advance to all of you on this panel today. My first question is for Mr. Stoll, and it's really for the Canadian industry. We just heard from Mr. Magnus regarding potential expansion of the TRQ and how the Mexican industry sees that. You mentioned in your testimony, and this was from Canadian Solar, Silfab, and Helion, and also Mr. Stoll, to expand significantly or eliminate the TRQ on cells. If the TPSC were to recommend expanding the TRQ on cells, by how much would you recommend, and what's the basis for that recommendation?
Thank you very much, Mike. This is Jonathan Stoll, for the record. As you heard, on behalf of Canadian industry, we do support expanding the TRQ. I think you heard this morning from Hanwha that they supported, I believe, 5 gigawatts as the, and be clear, we're talking about no tariff on solar cells up to 5 gigawatts. We would concur that that should be the minimum amount. We think the key here is to align the TRQ with expected solar module capacity. As I think both Helion and Silfab have testified, what we really don't want is to have another tax on U.S. manufacturing. I mean, these companies are already manufacturing here in the United States. Both companies have announced expansions of their capacity and also new hirings of U.S. workers. We don't want to, make that more difficult. And just to make sure I emphasize, so Mr. Paktarik is happy, that's the same with the Section 301 tariffs. We've applied to have 301 tariffs on certain key inputs removed. Again, those are taxes on U.S. manufacturing. I think as the committee looks holistically at how to improve U.S. manufacturing of solar products, we ought to think about how to eliminate all those taxes that inhibit our ability to do that. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much. And I have a follow-up question for Silfab and Helian. We had posed in writing that if the president were to take no action to extend the solar safeguard measure, I was wondering what impact you would expect that to have on your U.S. module production operations.
Yeah, well, I believe I testified. Obviously, not having tariffs on our Canadian operation would be extremely beneficial because we'll generate a significant amount, double digits of millions, that we would be investing in the U.S.
However, right, not having tariffs on the rest of the world, right? So if the safeguard would be not renewed, then despite the direct benefit of Canada, which is a benefit to Helian and Silfab, what we see is that the price in the US will adjust down, therefore compressing margins overall. So that is something that we need to consider in our business plans on how would, in the possible presence of no tariffs for the rest of the world, what would that do, in terms of demand and supply and compression of margins?
I think, Mike, I want to emphasize that I think both companies are planning on expanding their investments in the United States, but just being candid, the tariff on Canada takes away monies that are destined for U.S. manufacturing. There's no plan from any of the companies, including, as you heard from Mr. Ambrose earlier for Canadian Solar, to expand the production capacity in Canada. So all the dollars that are being paid in tariffs, whether it's on solar cells, if the TRQ isn't expanded, or if the tariff is not rescinded with respect to Canadian exports, those are simply taxes on American manufacturing.
Has that responded to your question?
Yes, that was responsive. Thank you very much. I think at this point, I don't have any further questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Martin from USTR at this point. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. I just have one question. It sounds to me like your proposal for a TRQ is to set the TRQ at a level where the tariff would never apply to a single imported cell. So if that is the objective, what is the point of having a TRQ? Shouldn't you be recommending that we just eliminate the tariff on cells?
John Magnus from Axion, that's certainly what we've recommended. And if you feel obliged to stick with the TRQ structure, then it should be expanded to account for all existing and announced ModCo capacity in the United States.
We would agree with Mr. Magnus's comments. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That's the end of my questions. I see that Mr. Mroczka has a question, so please go ahead.
Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, my question is for Mr. Ambrose. Where I thought you were going in your testimony was in addressing petitioner's comments about some of the concerns raised about Canadian solar. But you didn't quite get there. And so I do want to kind of circle back to that. I think the main concern that is out there is that about a potential circumvention threat should a exclusion be given to Canada through Canadian solar. Kind of to put you on the spot, but what assurances can you provide that that will not be the case or that will not happen should there be an exclusion granted?
Hi, Victor. Good to see you. This is Jonathan.
Hey, Jonathan.
Happy New Year to you, my friend. Wanted to, just answer briefly, just because some of this information is confidential, but it is in the ITC record. And that is, the size of the Canadian solar facility in Canada had already diminished before the ITC's original investigation. So we're talking about a very small facility up there. And as Mr. Ambrose testified, the company really has been focused almost entirely on research and development in Canada. So, I don't want to repeat some of my clients' rhetoric from their testimony. They're the clients that get to use rhetoric. I'm the steady lawyer here before you. But the idea that Canadian Solar is preparing to make some big move in Canada that would somehow threaten the U.S. industry, it's not logical and it's not true. And as you heard from Mr. Ambrose, in fact, the company is very focused on the U.S. industry and developing and promoting the U.S. solar industry, including looking at U.S. manufacturing operations. So I think that's really the important points for the committee to consider. But with that, let me make sure Mr. Ambrose has a chance to respond as well.
Sure, we'd be happy to. I think first and foremost, circumvention is illegal. I think we dealt with that anti-circumvention policy issue earlier this year as part of the industry. So first and foremost, we don't do anything that's illegal. Secondarily, we've wound down our manufacturing operations to just an R&D facility. So any threat we could pose would entail an entire rebuild of our manufacturing facility, which we have no intentions of doing. As was articulated earlier in the testimony, it's actually more cost effective to do business in the US than it is in Canada. So for those reasons, we should pose no threat to the US marketplace.
John Magnus from Maxion, just adding that the very same considerations apply in Mexico. The size of Maxion's ramp at the factory there is a publicly known thing, and it is threatening to exactly nobody in the domestic industry.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Heuermann, you're the next in line.
Thanks, Mr. Merton. Just want to follow up on some of the comments that you all have just recently made about domestic production, both in Canada and in Mexico. You've both talked about it being more cost efficient, or at least the Canadians have talked about it being more cost efficient to invest in production in the United States. I'm sorry, I forget the name of the gentleman from Maxion, talked about investing in production in the US as well as investing in production in Mexico. How does the safeguard tariff play into the decisions for Maxion to expand in both the US and in Mexico? And then also, can you talk about some of the factors that make it more cost effective to invest in the United States for manufacturing? Thank you.
John Magnus from Maxion. The biggest factor with respect to the United States is the tax incentives that Congress is trying to enact at the moment. Should that happen, it would justify substantial investments in U.S. production. The location of those investments could certainly be affected by what happens with respect to the safeguard measure. And the ability to serve the market in the southwestern United States with modules assembled across the border in Mexico is a very important puzzle piece.
This is Jonathan Stoll. Ms. Heeman just responding as well. I mean, two things. One, I think, as John very well said, we really are supporters of the administration's efforts for Build Back Better. We think that's critical, as SIA and ACP testified very well this morning, and we really hope that gets done. All the companies on the Zoom today with you are strongly supportive of that. And then the second thing is, you really do need to take a holistic approach at what supports U.S. manufacturing, as Mr. Paktarik talked about, and I did. The Section 301 tariffs are really tough. That's a really big tax on American manufacturing. There are certain products like solar glass and other things that we've explained to USTR and to the administration you simply can't get from other sources. And so you're just imposing a tax on American manufacturing through those taxes. And I commend USTR, TIE, and others as you look at that possible new exclusions under 301. So I think you need a holistic approach to what makes sense for U.S. manufacturing. And I can say for the three companies from Canada, all of us would be very pleased to discuss that with the committee moving forward and try to provide suggestions if those would be helpful to you. Thanks so much.
So just to clarify, in the absence of other policy changes, the safeguard tariff itself isn't what makes production in the United States more cost competitive or not. It isn't a driving factor on U.S. investments.
I may be able to add something, Dr. Ehrman. So in our case, most of our customers are US residential. They want a US made product. Most of them are aware that Canada is not part of the United States yet, and they do want something produced in the US. So it's as simple as that, serving what the customer wants.
John Magnus from Axion. I think what you've seen over nearly 4 years is that import relief was sufficient to catalyze some investment in module assembly and none in cell making. In fact, cell making, you saw disinvestment and fab closures. And that's a pretty good indication of what import relief can get you. The announcements that you're hearing, which are SEMA dependent, are a pretty good indication of what affirmative incentives can get you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Nagus.
Hi, yes, this is Olivia Negus representing Department of Labor. I had a question specifically for Mr. Magnus from Axion. I was wondering if you had any job creation figures associated with your planned expansion of production of cells and modules in the US. Thank you.
I should have, they're not in my notes for this, but I will collect that before this panel is over and either speak up again or put it in the chat. It's a large number, but I don't want to get it wrong. So if I may have about 60 seconds, I'll dig it out.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Mr. Amder.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to go back to one of the questions that was provided to the panel participants prior to the panel, and it's probably more relevant to representatives from Silfab and Helion, since there are, so I understand you're module producers in the United States. And basically the question was about how the ITC in its extension review report recommended changing the tariff rate quota on solar cells from annual quota to quarterly quotas. And how would you expect that to affect imports of solar products in the United States and prices in the US market?
If I may, I don't think it makes a difference to us. It's really up to you. You need to administer it quarterly versus yearly. When you look at the imports monthly, I would say they're pretty regular. There is no seasonality to it. So in our case, we don't see any difference really of having that volume allocation being quarterly or yearly. I mean, for example, right now we are at the beginning of January and we are selling May, right? So we are already buying cells that will be shipped by container to the US for, that will arrive in late April for manufacturing in May. So our planning goes 4 to 5 months ahead.
I just want to add that we are purchasing a lot of cells that currently we are not making. So there is the possibility for others that are fully integrated to perhaps try to game the system and to go first past the post and introduce a lot of product and taking all the quota. I don't know which one of the two is a better mechanism. Perhaps the quarterly is better, but I don't really have a solution to that problem.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Amber, Jonathan, so just one point, because of Mr. Macario's testimony. I mean, if you had a binding TRQ to Mr. Martin's question earlier, where unfortunately you started having a tax, then I think frankly having some mechanism to ensure that folks like the two gentlemen on the call don't end up paying a tax is key. So I think if having something quarterly would give you more flexibility to avoid that situation, that would obviously be helpful for the broader U.S. manufacturing industry. And we thank you for thinking about this in advance. We know how much work Customs has to do to administer all these things. So thanks so much.
No, thank you.
All right, I think that's the end of our questions. Is there anybody else from the TPSC who has a question? I said from the TPSC, John. All right. I
hit the wrong button. I have a jobs number if this is an okay time for that. Direct jobs, estimated direct jobs, 1,700.
Thank you very much. All
You are muted.
Thank you. With that, we will end panel 3 and move on to panel 4. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming to speak with us today and for all of, yes? Oh, I see, that was a wave. All right. Thank you for coming to talk to us and for your testimony, which has given us a lot to think about. So thank you and have a good rest of the
And Mike.
Thanks so much.
Our last panel for today, which is panel 4. We will hear from the Embassy of Canada, Government of Canada. We'll hear from the Government of Mexico, and we'll hear from the Trade Remedies Authority of Vietnam, Government of Vietnam. We'll proceed in that order. Each of the 3 participants has 10 minutes to provide testimony. Ronaldo Smith from USTR will track your time. As you proceed, we request once again that you identify your name and title, similar to how we proceeded with the earlier panels. Ms. Olay, is the Government of Canada ready to proceed?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Annie Ouellet. I'm the Counselor for Trade Policy at the Embassy of Canada here in Washington. I'm appearing today to provide Canada's views on this matter. My appearance does not constitute an express or implied waiver by the Government of Canada of any applicable diplomatic immunities or privileges. The Government of Canada's clear position in this investigation is that if the Trade Policy Staff Committee recommends that the President extend the safeguard measure, then it should also recommend to the President that imports from Canada be excluded from any extension. Today, I would like to begin by underscoring that President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau have expressed their commitment to work together to address the climate crisis and facilitate secure and resilient North American supply chains for critical goods and industries. We are like-minded partners building a competitive and innovative North American green energy future. The solar sector is a key example of how a strong partnership between Canada and the US can lead to the faster deployment of new green technologies, to the development of a robust manufacturing sector, and to the creation of new jobs. This is evidenced by the fact that over the past 4 years, the Canadian solar industry has invested more than $100 million to develop manufacturing facilities in the United States, creating hundreds of American jobs and improving US solar module technology. These investments will create an additional 1.7 gigawatts of solar module production capacity in the US by next year. It is our sincere hope that the Canadian and US solar industries will continue to expand their partnership for years to come. However, the safeguard tariff imposed by President Trump in February 2018 threatens our industry's shared prosperity. To start, President Trump should never have imposed a safeguard tariff on imports from Canada. In the original investigation, the US International Trade Commission found under the NAFTA Implementation Act that imports from Canada did not constitute a substantial share of total imports and that they did not contribute importantly to any serious injury caused by total imports. As a result, the Commission's majority recommended that Canada be excluded from any safeguard action. But President Trump disregarded these findings and unilaterally imposed a tariff on Canada. Moreover, for the past 4 years, Canadian and US module manufacturers alike have been hurt by the tariff. You heard earlier this afternoon from Helion and Silfab, Canadian companies that manufacture solar modules in Canada and in the United States. Both companies sell small quantities of their Canadian-made modules into the United States. These companies also have invested in 4 separate US module manufacturing facilities in Minnesota, Washington State, and Florida. Unfortunately, the tariff currently being applied hinders potential future investments from Canadian companies in US solar manufacturing. This extension proceeding now provides an important opportunity for the Biden administration to revisit this issue, and by doing so, to help both industries. The president has the authority under US law to exclude imports from Canada from this safeguard measure. Moreover, under the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, the United States is in fact required to exclude imports from Canada. We have detailed in our written comments submitted on December 15 the legal basis for such an exclusion. In addition, there is even stronger factual support now than in the original investigation to exclude Canada from an extended safeguard, which I will take the opportunity to speak to now. First, Canada's share of total imports is minimal and declining. Once again, imports from Canada do not constitute a substantial share of imports. Second, there has been no injury, serious or otherwise, caused by imports from Canada. On the contrary, as I've already mentioned, Canadian companies have invested millions of dollars in the US economy, built and expanded US solar manufacturing, and created hundreds of American jobs. Lifting the safeguard tariff on imports from Canada would benefit the US industry producing solar products through additional investment opportunities from Canada. Third, Canadian modules are high-value products made in a US allied country by industry partners employing high labor standards. These Canadian products present no threat to the US industry. This illegal and harmful tariff on solar panels from Canada is a critical issue for my government and is even more pressing now than 4 years ago. In fact, the safeguard tariff is the subject of Canada's first state-to-state dispute against the United States under Chapter 31 of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. Canada urges the United States to act quickly to comply with its legal commitments and remove the tariff. For all of these reasons, the Government of Canada renews its request to be excluded from any extended safeguard measure. Our industries are linked. Our companies, our workers, our clean energy goals, and our challenges are similar. Our measures must be too. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. Counsel for the Canadian industry and the Government of Canada provided answers to the advanced questions posed to Canada earlier this afternoon. I'm available to answer any additional questions alongside our outside counsel, Jonathan Stoll of Hogan Lovells. Thank you.
All right.
I apologize. I had some connectivity issues just then. If the government of Canada has concluded, we would move to the government of Mexico now.
Can I start? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
we can. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the United States Trade Policy Staff Committee today. My name is Cesar Remis, and I am the head of Mexico's Office for the implementation of the USMCA at the Embassy of Mexico in the US. In my brief statement, I plan to focus on two main issues. First, that currently exports from Mexico to the US are minimal, therefore do not constitute a threat to the US industry. Second, we will show that the imports from Mexico do not meet the requirements established in the USMCA to impose them as safeguards. Therefore, they must be excluded. The actual level and downward trend of imports from Mexico indicate that they do not represent a threat to the domestic industry in the US. For instance, in 2020, Mexico's share of total US import of CSPV products represented only 1% of imports, and between 2015 and 2020, US imports from Mexico decreased in terms of value by more than 90%. Mexico's position is that if the US decides to extend the safeguard, it must carry out the exclusion analysis provided for in the USMCA and Section 301A and 301B of the USMCA Implementation Act, which established the obligation to exclude imports from other parties from the application of a safeguard unless affirmative determinations are made concerning two conditions. First, that imports from that party account for a substantial share of total import. And second, that those imports also contribute importantly to the serious injury. Import from Mexico did not meet any of those requirements. Import from a party account for a substantial share of total import if that party is among the top 5 suppliers of the investigated product. From 2018 to 2020, import from Mexico did not represent a substantial share of total import because Mexico was not among the top five suppliers in 2 of these 3 years, 2019 and 2020, and moved further away from the 5 suppliers each year. In 2018, Mexico was the 5th largest supplier. In 2019, it was the 6th largest supplier, and in 2020, it was at the 8th place. To decide if import from a party contributes importantly to the serious injury, the investigating authorities shall carry out a 2-step analysis. The first step is to analyze the import share and its changes, and the level of import and its changes. During the 3 years following the imposition of the safeguard measure, 2018 to 2020, the value of import from Mexico decreased considerably in terms of value, reaching their lowest point in 2020. However, the decreasing trend of import from Mexico did not begin with the imposition of the measure in 2018, but rather started in 2015. The value of import from Mexico continued to decline during the 3 years following the imposition of the measure at a significant rate, going from $301 million in 2018 to $89 million in 2020, a 70.6% decrease. Moreover, between 2015, the year when the decline of Mexican imports started, and 2020, the decrease in the value of imports from Mexico reached 90.3%. Furthermore, Mexico's share of total U.S. import also decreased drastically from 11.4% in 2018 to 1.3% in 2020. In the final report of the extension review, the ITC agreed that the import of CSPV module from Mexico and Mexico's market share declined from 2018 to 2020. The second step to decide if import from a party contributes importantly to the serious injury requires an additional examination that involves comparing the import trend from a party and the total import. Specifically, the USMCA provides that a party normally should not be deemed to contribute importantly to serious injury if the growth rate of imports from a party is appreciably lower than the growth rate of total import from all sources. This is clearly the case. While imports from Mexico decreased by 70% between 2018 and 2020, total import grew by 154% in the same period. Therefore, the growth rate of Mexican import was appreciably lower than the growth rate of total import in that period. Mexican import did not constitute a substantial share of total import and did not contribute importantly to any serious injury caused by total import. Therefore, according to the US law and the USMCA, the committee should recommend to the president that Mexico be excluded from any extended safeguard measure. If Mexico remains covered by the measure and is not compensated, my government will have no alternative but to suspend concession at the level of our trade damages, according to Article 10.2.6 of the USMCA. Finally, Mexico understands that for the Biden administration, climate considerations are an essential element of US foreign policy and national security. Nevertheless, extending the safeguard measure to USMCA trading partners will put the US climate agenda at risk. We believe that the only way for the North American region to remain competitive is by deepening the integration of our supply chains rather than isolating in production. Therefore, our manufacturing platform must continue to complement each other while working together to make trade easier. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today.
And thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Son Bui from the government of Vietnam, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
Michael.
thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Son Bui from the Trade Office, Embassy of Vietnam. And first of all, we would like to appreciate the opportunity to provide comments on behalf of the government of Vietnam for the consideration by the USTR through TPSC hearing today concerning the safeguard measure on CSP cells and models. Firstly, it should be emphasized that any extension made by the USTR must be consistent with the US obligation under the WTO. In this regard, we would like to note that in case the US decides to extend the current safeguard measure, other WTO members, including Vietnam, can exercise our right of suspension or compensation for the adverse effects of the measures on the trade, in accordance with Article 8 of the WTO Agreement on Safeguard, which might negatively impact the US export. More importantly, both safeguard extension and retaliate tariffs, which are supposed to be on a variety of different industries, would interrupt our effort to recover from the pandemic losses, both in the US and relevant economies. Secondly, the safeguard tariff on solar panels is a no-win measure, which not only adversely affects the exporting country to the US, but also causes detrimental influence on the market, on the US market. Owing in part to the safeguard tariffs, solar panels prices in the US are the highest in the world. The US domestic industry can supply only a fraction of the demand for solar panels in the US. And most of the US production is dedicated to residential and commercial application. Utility scale developers thus are reliant on imported solar panels. The continued application of safeguard duties on imported solar cells and panels hinders growth in the US solar energy sector. Furthermore, the tariff prevents job growth not only in the solar cell sector, but also in the broader solar industry that dependent on the deployment of solar energy. The short-term protection given to domestic solar cells and panel manufacturers in the form of tariffs might become a trade-off for other long-term goals of development. Finally, we are aware that the President committed to achieve a carbon-free power sector by 2035 and a net zero emissions by no later than 2050. To meet this goal, the administration planned to increase clean electricity from current 38% to 100% in 15 years. Not only within US border, the administration also leads and encourages global development of clean renewable energy in a common effort to address climate change challenges, particularly at the COP26 meeting recently in Glasgow, Scotland. Toward achieving these goals, it is critical to ensure solar energy is an economically viable energy source with aggressive growth. The proposed extension of the current safeguard with harmful impacts on solar energy sector, both in the US and other countries, would hinder the President's and administration's attempt to realize the promise. From today's hearing, I guess the option is now between requests of some companies proposing extension and the other side is economic and environmental benefits of opposing parties, which are more than double in number. In a broader context of the whole economy, I believe today's participation pattern really reflects significantly different levels of interest of each group and impact on them. Taking into consideration all the above arguments, Vietnam respectfully requests that the TPSC not extend the current safeguard measures against CSP cells and modules. We received 2 questions from TPSC and will be happy to share answer today or email you later for your kind consideration. Again, thank you very much for this opportunity to provide our comments. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your testimony. We'll now move to the question and answer session. And I want to begin with the government of Vietnam. As you indicated at the end of your testimony, we did pose 2 advanced written questions to the government of Vietnam. And we would like to hear your answers to those questions during this hearing. So if you could please provide some detail. Just as a quick recollection, the first question was in your written comments at page 2, you contend that the safeguard measure as applied to solar panels is not saving US jobs, and that these duties prevent job growth in the cell sector and the broader industry that's dependent on the deployment of solar energy. But in its report, the ITC found that the domestic industry's employment indicators for module production all increased between 2018 and 2020. So we're just wondering if you could reconcile your position that the safeguard measure as applied to solar panels is not saving US jobs in light of the ITC's findings that employment indicators for module productions increased during the past few years. Thanks.
Sure. I would like to share answers to those 2 questions at the same time. Firstly, it should be noted that the US ITC findings on the domestic industry's employment indicators are complied from data submitted in response to the Commission questionnaires. In the page 36 of the US ITC's report, the Commission indicated that the Commission sent US producers questionnaires to 64 firms, but the Commission received usable response from 14 firms only. And thus, it is doubtful that the US ITC data may not be representative enough for the whole US solar industry. Secondly, the government of Vietnam, we refer to the National Solar Jobs Census by the Solar Foundation as the main source for our argument. Accordingly, before the safeguard investigation in 2017, employment in the broader US solar industry were expanding rapidly, growing by 178% from 2010 to 2016, or by more than 160,000 jobs. To be precise, from 93,502 to 260,077 jobs. And the Solar Foundation has predicted the trend to continue, expecting solar employment to reach 263,293 jobs by the end of 2018. However, under the Safeguard Action, the US solar industry did not reach its full potential. In 2017 and 18, the US solar industry lost jobs for the first time since 2010. The total number of jobs increased modestly in 19, but declined again in 2020. The COVID pandemic no doubt contributed to the more recent job losses, but the overall trend following the high mark of 2016, the year before the safeguard petition was filed, reversed years of significant growth in solar industry employment. And that is the reason why the government of Vietnam accuses that safeguard tariff on solar panel are not saving US jobs. In fact, the tariff prevents job growth not only in the solar sales sector, but also in relevant sector. So those are our replies to your questions. Thank you. And we'll be happy to email you details later.
Okay, thank you for your responses. At this point, I do not have further questions for the panel, so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Martin now. Thank you.
I do not have any questions either, so I will look to our colleagues from the TPSC to see if any of them have questions. Please raise your hands if you do. All right, I am seeing no hands, so I will take that to mean that there are no further questions. And therefore, I will thank the members of this panel, the representatives of the governments of Canada, Mexico, and Vietnam for their presentations today. And hope that you all have a good rest of the day. And with that, I think that also ends this hearing. So I will once again, at this point, not thank individual panels, but all of our witnesses and all of the interagency participants who have listened and asked questions. All of the testimony has been very useful to us. We will be considering it very carefully and moving quickly to make a recommendation to the president. Repeating what we said at the beginning of the session, we will not be asking for or accepting additional submissions of factual information after the end of this hearing. Everything you said has been recorded by the court reporter, so we do not need anything more. And with that, we are finished. So again, thank you, everyone. Mike, are there any more administrative details, or is that it from your perspective as well?
No, I believe that's it, Will. Do we want to mention anything about post-hearing submissions? Because there were certain suggestions throughout the hearing about that.
Thank you. Yes, we will not be, again, asking for post-hearing submissions or accepting post-hearing submissions. The one exception will be that 2 of SIA's witnesses had their testimony seriously garbled by transmission problems. And for those 2 individuals, we will be taking a copy of the written statements so that the transcriber can make use of those to correct any problems that crept up because of the transmission difficulties. So again, thank you very much. And I do not have a gavel, so I will just I guess, metaphorically gavel us out and say thank you to everyone